In every gilded court, behind every jeweled crown, there's a locked door the history books won't open. Tonight, we're kicking it wide. These are not tales of noble speeches or glorious battles. These are the whispered scandals, the secret rituals, and the bizarre appetites of kings who ruled with velvet gloves and very peculiar tastes. From hidden passageways to custom-built contraptions, their desires shaped empires as much as their wars. This is the history you weren't meant to hear, and once you do, you'll never look at a royal portrait the same way again. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of history's strangest royal secrets. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. It's easy to forget that royalty, for all their polished portraits and public speeches, often lived lives shaped more by desire than by duty, and sometimes that desire required carpentry. Edward VII of the United Kingdom, born Albert Edward, was never meant to be remembered for political genius or military prowess. His legacy wasn't built on diplomacy or law. It was built, quite literally, on a custom-crafted love chair in Paris. A throne of sorts, designed to keep him from crushing his partners under the weight of his royal appetites. Yes, Edward was a large man. By the time he reached his middle years, he had become something of a walking contradiction, stuffed into silk waistcoats and stuffed with 5-course meals. And yet his appetite for company outpaced even his waistline. It wasn't the mere fact that he had mistresses. That was par for the course in royal circles. It was the operational scale. Edward didn't have lovers. He had logistics. He frequented the famed brothels of Paris, not with secrecy, but with ceremony, and the French, ever pragmatic, adapted to their client. Maison le Chabanais, a luxurious den of velvet and discretion, became a second palace. It was here that the infamous chair was commissioned, a device with stirrups, padded rests, and structural integrity befitting a monarch. Its purpose? To enable the king to engage in his preferred arrangements with 2 partners at once, without physical injury. Imagine the royal carpenter's notes. Supports up to £250, upholstery, burgundy, intimacy, optimized. But the absurdity of it all was never the punchline. The real twist came in the contrast. A man who could barely be trusted with decorum in a dining room was somehow expected to lead an empire. The Victorian public adored the image of the dutiful queen and her brood of moral offspring, so when Edward, the heir, turned out to be a libertine in tailored trousers, it created a kind of social cognitive dissonance. He was banished from influence during Queen Victoria's reign, reduced to opening garden parties and inspecting troops, while the real decisions happened behind tightly sealed doors. And yet, his popularity never waned. There was something almost grotesquely relatable about him, a man too human for the job he was born into. He smoked cigars the length of his forearm, devoured foie gras by the pound, and dallied with women whose names were whispered with both envy and disdain. His favourite mistress, Alice Keppel, was given a grace and loyalty that no parliament ever received. She was said to soothe his temper, advise him in private matters, and once reportedly convinced him not to declare war out of sheer spite. That's a level of influence most cabinet ministers could only fantasize about. But Edward's indulgences were never just private affairs. They were public symptoms of a much deeper rot. The British Empire was at its peak outwardly stoic, militarily dominant, industrially unshakable, and yet its heir apparent was spending his nights reclining on a custom-engineered contraption, attended by Parisian professionals who knew him more intimately than half his ministers. Was it hypocrisy? Absolutely. But it was also prophecy. When Edward finally ascended the throne in 1901, it marked the beginning of the end of the Victorian illusion. His reign, brief and largely ceremonial, was less a rule and more a reckoning. He wasn't just a king. He was a mirror held up to an empire that had convinced itself it was morally superior to the very colonies it exploited. Edward VII's love chair wasn't just furniture. It was an artifact of the quiet contradiction that sat at the heart of modern monarchy. The illusion of decorum maintained by a very physical, very human mess behind the curtain. And the deeper irony? That very chair tucked away in some collector's vault or museum basement might just be one of the most honest symbols of British imperialism. Because what is empire, if not the attempt to dress up indulgence as duty, to call conquest civilization, to put gold trim on contradictions no one wants to admit are there? And as Edward puffed on his cigar and surveyed the world he would briefly inherit, one wonders if he ever considered what might happen when the chair broke not the wooden one in Paris, but the metaphorical one, the brittle, overburdened throne of an empire teetering on decadence. Of course, he didn't. That sort of foresight was left to historians. He was too busy reclining. And just as Edward faded into ceremonial comfort, another Roman figure from far earlier, but no less indulgent, was busy collapsing the difference between ruler and spectacle. A man who not only broke the rules of the empire, but rewrote them on velvet scrolls of absurdity and blood. A performer, a tyrant, and perhaps the first monarch to turn power itself into a kind of erotic theatre. Nero was waiting. Emperor Nero of Rome. History has a funny way of forgiving power, at least for a while. But some men push so far into the theatre of absurdity that even centuries can't fully sand down the scandal. Nero wasn't simply an emperor. He was a fire starter with a golden fiddle and a stage set for tragedy, a man who wore the imperial purple as if it were drag because, often, it was. When Nero became emperor at just 16, Rome sighed. Not in relief, in anticipation of drama. The boy had been raised under the shadow of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman so determined to rule vicariously that many believed she poisoned her way into palace influence. She pushed Nero to power, stood behind the throne, and whispered every decision until, one day, he had her stabbed, then claimed she had fallen on her own sword. Multiple times. But matricide was only the first act. Nero wasn't interested in ruling Rome. He wanted to perform for it. Music, poetry, theatre. The emperor didn't want to be Caesar. He wanted to be celebrated. And in a city that demanded blood in the morning and applause by dusk, Nero blurred the line between empire and cabaret. His palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was an architectural hallucination. Imagine ceilings that rotated to mimic the stars, banquet halls with panels designed to drop rose petals and perfume on guests mid-meal. It was less a home and more a living hallucination, like Versailles designed by a fever dream. In this palace, Nero staged operas with himself as star. He sang, acted, danced, recited poetry. The senators, chained to etiquette, clapped until their palms bruised. One story goes that women faked labor to leave mid-performance, while men jumped over walls to avoid another hour of imperial monologue. But Nero's obsession with performance didn't stop at the arts. His personal life followed a script only he could understand. He married, of course, but quickly grew bored. Soon, he sought novelty in forms the Senate could barely whisper. Nero took 2 men as spouses in separate ceremonies, one of whom he dressed as a Roman matron, the other as a husband. The weddings were real. The paperwork was official. The empire watched its ruler dissolve traditional roles as easily as a stage curtain. To Nero, identity was malleable, ceremonial, theatrical. One night, he was an emperor. The next, a grieving bride at the funeral of a lover he'd kicked to death in a fit of rage, only to then replace the man with a slave who resembled him eerily well. Nero dressed the new partner in the dead man's clothes, gave him the same name, and introduced him at banquets as if nothing had happened. His Rome was a stage of mirrored delusion. Power was not just exercised, it was costumed, choreographed, and sold as spectacle. Sexuality, too, was a matter of aesthetics, props, and shock value. Nero didn't crave intimacy, he craved roles. He didn't want lovers, he wanted audiences. The irony, of course, was that behind the curtains and the floral-scented orgies, the empire was cracking. The provinces rebelled, the coffers bled gold, the Senate grumbled. The people, once entertained, grew restless, and Nero, sensing the shift, didn't tighten control. He just added more costume changes. Eventually, even the velvet couldn't muffle the rot. The Praetorian Guard turned on him. He fled Rome in disguise, muttering that the world had lost a great actor. And when the blade finally reached him, guided not by an assassin, but by his own hand, his last words were not imperial, but theatrical. What an artist dies in me. He died as he lived, mistaking power for performance. But Nero left behind more than scandal. He left behind a blueprint for rulers who couldn't separate the throne from the theatre, who mistook domination for divine entertainment. And few took that blueprint more seriously than the boy king who came a century and a half later, not just wearing wigs and gowns, but practically begging the empire to crucify him for his appetites. Elagabalus didn't want to rule Rome. He wanted to rewrite what Rome even meant. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome. By the time Elagabalus took the Roman throne, the empire was already exhausted. Exhausted by assassinations disguised as promotions. Exhausted by generals with too many medals and not enough morals. Exhausted by emperors who turned power into theatre. And yet, Rome still wasn't ready for Elagabalus, a teenager from Syria who arrived in the capital like a velvet-wrapped thunderstorm. He was just 14 when declared emperor a living god, according to his mother and grandmother, who orchestrated his rise with the kind of political finesse that usually involves poison and priests. But the divine boy didn't act like Augustus or even Nero. He acted like someone who saw the throne not as a responsibility, but as an instrument of personal expression, an ancient TikTok feed with no filter, all spectacle, and a complete disregard for public opinion. His real name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. The name Elagabalus came from the Syrian sun god he served as high priest. That should have been the first clue. When your emperor is named after a deity of fire and ecstasy, expectations should be adjusted accordingly. He didn't ease into power, he smashed into it, draped in silk and surrounded by dancers, eunuchs and whispers. The Roman elite, grim-faced, stoic, allergic to improvisation, were horrified. Not because he had tastes, but because he made no effort to hide them. Elagabalus turned the imperial palace into a personal playground of aesthetic chaos. He replaced Jupiter with Elagabal, the foreign god from his homeland, and built a lavish temple where Romans were expected to bow and pretend they understood what was going on. They didn't. But what disturbed Rome most wasn't religious. It was personal. Elagabalus blurred every line that Roman society had spent centuries carving in stone. He wore makeup, plucked his body hair, painted his eyes, and dressed in gowns sewn from gold thread. He referred to himself as a woman in private, and in public he demanded to be called Empress. He married multiple times, men and women, sometimes both in the same year, with ceremonies so extravagant they made Nero's weddings look like potlucks. One of his most talked about relationships was with a charioteer named Hierocles. whom Elagabalus reportedly called his husband and treated as a dominant partner, an inversion of social norms that sent the Roman aristocracy into a kind of moral allergic reaction. The rumors were relentless that he offered money to surgeons to craft him new anatomy, that he hosted contests among his lovers to determine who had the most manly strength, that he lined banquet cushions with rose petals so deep they smothered guests. Rome loved spectacle, but it feared spectacle that didn't explain itself, and Elagabalus had no interest in explaining anything. He didn't even pretend to be Roman. He was a foreign god prince in a city still pretending to be a republic. To the Senate, he was chaos incarnate. To the people, he was scandal with a crown. But to himself, Elagabalus was a performance art piece, a living contradiction. A monarch who treated gender, identity, power, and religion like colours on a palette to be mixed, blurred, reapplied. In the palace, he surrounded himself with delicate boys, dancers, actors, and guards selected more for aesthetics than loyalty. He gave out government jobs in exchange for flattery, summoned entire councils just to decide his next outfit, and treated military campaigns like fashion shows. He didn't rule, he curated. But Rome imperial, conservative, self-important Rome had limits, and Elagabalus didn't just cross them, he danced over them in heels. His grandmother, who had orchestrated his rise, eventually realized the city's patience was disintegrating. Fearing a full-scale revolt, she aligned herself with the Praetorian Guard. And, one day, in a plot as Roman as it was inevitable, Elagabalus was dragged from his chambers and murdered alongside his mother. His body was thrown into the Tiber, stripped not just of clothing, but of identity, erased from history, rewritten in shame, but not forgotten. Because Elagabalus didn't just push the boundaries of imperial decorum, he revealed how fragile those boundaries were. That behind Rome's granite laws and marble temples lived a fear of ambiguity, of softness, of the unclassifiable. He didn't just scandalize the empire, he exposed it. And in his brief, chaotic reign, he left behind a question no dagger could answer. What if the real perversion wasn't in breaking the rules, but in pretending they were sacred to begin with? A question that echoed, centuries later, in the jeweled halls of another royal court, where men in ruffled collars wrote poetry by candlelight, watched masked dancers twirl under stained-glass windows, and passed whispered rumours about a monarch whose pleasures were wrapped in silks and secrets. France would never admit it, of course, but Henry III had turned voyeurism into politics. King Henry III of France. France has always had a flair for performance, the art, the fashion, the flirtation of revolution. But in the late 16th century, that flair wasn't just cultural, it was royal. King Henry III didn't just wear the crown, he accessorized it. With pearls, perfume, and a rotating entourage of male favourites known across the country not for their politics, but for their cheekbones. He was crowned at 22. Already infamous for his appearance and his appetites. Henry preferred silk to steel, incense to incensement. While other monarchs carved their legacy on the battlefield, Henry carved his into velvet robes and scented gloves. At a time when masculinity was defined by swordplay and siring airs, Henry hosted elaborate masked balls where courtiers danced in drag, veils, and scandal. To the Catholic League, he was a disgrace. To Protestant enemies, a caricature. To foreign diplomats, an enigma in heels. And to France? France wasn't sure. Henry was a contradiction the public couldn't categorize. He prayed daily, dressed like a peacock, and disciplined his enemies with a level of precision that defied his otherwise decadent aesthetic. He spent hours in confession and even longer in costume. His court was filled with religious relics and erotic performances. Some of them reportedly happened on the same night. The contradictions weren't hidden. They were choreographed. At the center of this paradox stood the mignons, a group of exquisitely dressed, impossibly beautiful young men who followed the king like a living fashion accessory line. They wore earrings, curled their hair, and whispered politics between flirtations. The nobility loathed them. The people mocked them. The king adored them. Henry's fondness for these companions wasn't just emotional, it was theatrical. He choreographed their dances, arranged their duels, and sat watching from his throne as they bled for honor or attention. In one legendary case, a group of mignons engaged in a public sword fight over a perceived insult, an event so violent it shocked even a France desensitized to violence. Several died, not for nation nor king, but for vanity, for spectacle. And yet, Henry remained unfazed. He wore mourning black for the fallen, gave grand speeches about virtue, and promptly resumed his nightly entertainments. Because for Henry, power wasn't just about law or war. It was about perception, about controlling the narrative, the lighting, the music, the masks. He understood, instinctively, that ruling France meant performing France, and that meant giving the audience something they'd never seen before. A king who confessed sin in the morning, wept in chapel, and then slipped into pearls by sundown. The rumors were endless, that he spied on couples through secret chambers, that he wore corsets beneath his royal tunic, that he commissioned erotic plays performed by candlelight while bishops dined nearby. Whether true or not hardly mattered. Henry seemed to blur fact and rumor by design. The ambiguity became his camouflage. But ambiguity is dangerous currency in a kingdom torn by religious war. France at the time was a cauldron of tension, Catholics, Huguenots, nobles, peasants, all boiling together under a king whose biggest scandal, to some, wasn't his indulgence, but his indifference. He seemed aloof to suffering, distant from the politics that actually mattered. While Paris burned with sectarian hatred, Henry adjusted his lace cuffs. Eventually, that contradiction caught up to him. In 1589, Henry was assassinated by a fanatical monk who believed he was cleansing France of corruption. But even his death felt staged a blade to the gut while he was recovering from yet another elaborate ceremony. Blood on silk. A final performance. Henry died childless, heirless, and surrounded by suspicion. The Valois line ended with him, not with a bang, but a scandal wrapped in ribbons. But in death, as in life, he left a question hanging in the perfumed air. What do we fear more, a king who sins in secret, or one who sins in full view and dares to decorate it? And just as France reeled from a monarch who turned morality into theatre, far across the world, another ruler quiet, calculating, and thousands of years removed from Versailles, was scripting fantasies of his own. Not in ballrooms, but in the gilded chambers of Han China, where roleplay, poetry, and politics melted together, and the emperor, behind closed doors, stopped being a sovereign and became something altogether more curious. Wu of Han was waiting. Emperor Wu of Han China. If there was ever a monarch who saw the imperial court as both a war room and a stage, it was Wu of Han. Ruled from 156 to 87 BCE, but don't let the centuries fool you, his story is as eerily modern as a scandal caught on CCTV. At first glance, Emperor Wu was the textbook strongman. He expanded the Han dynasty's borders, opened the Silk Road, crushed dissent, and restructured the bureaucracy. He was the kind of emperor who would conquer entire regions before breakfast and pen philosophical essays before lunch. And yet, behind that stoic bronze statue pose was a man quietly dismantling the boundaries between power and pleasure. Wu was not flamboyant. He was calculated a strategist in every aspect of life, including intimacy. He wasn't driven by chaos or hedonism like Nero or Elagabalus. He didn't need to throw roses from the ceiling. His indulgences were slower, subtler, and in many ways far stranger. Because where other rulers took lovers in secret, Wu curated them. Where others hid their desires behind locked doors, Wu folded his into ritual. He wasn't just a king who enjoyed roleplay, he was a sovereign who turned history into fetish. His court was massive, literally. Thousands of servants, eunuchs, scholars, guards, and most notably, concubines, many selected less for beauty than for their resemblance to figures from old folk tales and historical myths. The emperor, it seemed, didn't just want pleasure. He wanted reenactments. Women were trained to embody the roles of legendary beauties, tragic lovers, and even ancient enemies of China. He gave them scripts, costumes, sometimes entire stage sets. He played the hero, sometimes the villain, occasionally the prisoner. And no one, not the scholars, not the generals, dared question it. After all, these performances were cloaked in the language of cultural reverence. They weren't indulgences, they were philosophical meditations. At least, that's what the court scribes wrote down. But it didn't stop with women. Wu's harem included male favorites as well, a fact noted not with scandal, but with bureaucratic neutrality in the court archives. These young men, often selected from elite families or chosen for their musical and poetic talents, were given titles and responsibilities, but their real role was far more intimate. Wu saw no need to limit his affections. He spread them as he spread his empire strategically, indulgently, and always with an eye for symbolic value. It wasn't about impulse, it was about control. In Wu's world, intimacy was politics. He used affection to forge alliances, manipulate court factions, and neutralize threats. Promoting a concubine could calm a rebellious province. Elevating a male lover could unsettle a rival clan. His passions weren't weaknesses, they were weapons, and everyone knew it. But perhaps the most unnerving thing about Emperor Wu wasn't his private behavior. It was how completely it blurred into his public persona. There was no clear separation between court ritual and bedroom ritual. The same robes, the same incense, the same solemn music used to honor ancestors were often heard behind closed doors as he enacted scenes from long-dead dynasties, recreating moments of conquest and betrayal with live bodies and whispered scripts. It's said he once commissioned an erotic poem to be recited during a military victory banquet, not as entertainment, but as policy, to remind his ministers, subtly, that pleasure and power weren't opposites. They were partners, interchangeable, and always, always hierarchical. Was it perversion? Maybe. Was it madness? Possibly. But more likely, it was something far more unnerving. Clarity. Wu understood what few leaders ever do, that the distance between governance and gratification is razor thin. That emperors don't need to choose between the battlefield and the boudoir. They can rule from both, as long as no one dares call it what it is. And for decades, no one did. He reigned for over 50 years, a lifetime of carefully choreographed seduction, masquerading as statecraft. But even the most disciplined emperors leave a trail. And when he died, he left behind a court culture addicted to ritualized indulgence, a bureaucracy that had learned to speak in metaphor, and a legacy that whispered, not shouted, its moral ambiguity. And as his ashes cooled, far away in time and geography, another Roman emperor was already turning that whisper into a scream, stripping away the poetry, the symbolism, and the pretense. Where Wu seduced, Caligula conquered. Emperor Caligula of Rome. By the time Caligula took power, Rome had seen its share of corruption. Betrayals, stabbings, orgies, incompetence, these weren't bugs in the imperial system. They were features. But even in that blood-soaked, scandal-hardened landscape, Caligula managed to stand out like a fire in a funeral parlor. He didn't just break the rules, he lit them on fire, scattered the ashes over dinner, and laughed as senators choked on the smoke. Officially, his name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but nobody called him that. They called him Caligula, Little Boot, a nickname from childhood when he paraded around military camps in a miniature soldier's outfit, pretending to be a general while the real ones plotted world domination. It was cute until it wasn't. When his father, a celebrated general, mysteriously died and his family fell from favor, Caligula survived by becoming exactly what the empire demanded: invisible. He smiled for emperors who'd murdered his relatives. He played the quiet, unassuming grandson of Rome. But beneath that silence, something was calcifying, not grief, not fear, but a kind of gleeful nihilism. When Emperor Tiberius, a man known for his own disturbing retreat into island debauchery, finally died, the Senate breathed a sigh of relief. Caligula, young, handsome, and seemingly sane, stepped into power like a golden sunrise after a decade-long thunderstorm. That sunrise lasted about 6 months. Then came the darkness. Not gradual, not gentle. It hit like a decapitation. The official explanation was illness, a fever that struck him down, left him delirious, then changed him. The unofficial explanation was madness, or possession, or divine punishment. Or maybe the fever just knocked loose whatever fragments of morality he'd been pretending to carry. Whatever the reason, the Caligula who emerged from that sickbed was not a man. He was a performance. His reign became a theatre of cruelty, with the emperor as playwright, director, and lead actor. He turned the palace into a rotating stage of fear and farce. Senators were humiliated for sport. Nobles were ordered to run beside his chariot like horses. Entire banquets were held where guests didn't know if they were being honoured or prepped for execution. He once made his horse, Incitatus, a priest. Later, he supposedly tried to make him a consul. The move was so absurd that some historians argue it was satire, a mockery of the Senate's obsequiousness. But with Caligula, you could never tell if the joke was real or if the punchline was your funeral. And then there was the intimacy, not private, not quiet, but wielded like a weapon. He paraded his sisters through the palace like trophies. Whispers grew into rumours, rumours into certainty. That he took them to bed, that he took everyone to bed, wives of senators, noblemen's sons, temple virgins. Not for love, not even for pleasure, but for dominance, for theatre, for a kind of divine shock value. He didn't hide it, he flaunted it. He would call senators' wives to his chamber during banquets, disappear with them behind a curtain, then return and comment publicly on their performance, sometimes as critique, sometimes as mockery. And nobody objected. They couldn't. One wrong word, and your whole bloodline vanished. The line between Caligula's public policy and his private perversions didn't blur, it was deliberately erased. Laws bent to his moods. Trials were held for entertainment. Executions happened during meals. It wasn't just cruelty. It was curated insanity, as if the empire itself had become an interactive art exhibit in sadism. But here's the twist. He believed he was a god. Not metaphorically, literally. He declared himself divine, demanded temples, and instructed people to worship statues of him in their homes. Lightning bolts became omens, horses became oracles. He even ordered a bridge built across the Bay of Baiae so he could gallop across it in full armor, proving that he could defy prophecy and logic. And Rome, desperate to survive, nodded along, laughed at his jokes, applauded his speeches, and quietly sharpened knives. After just 4 years, the curtain finally dropped. A conspiracy among his own guards ended the performance. The assassination was brutal, frenzied, almost religious, like Rome was trying to purge itself of whatever spirit had taken hold. But Caligula left behind more than trauma. He left a warning. That unchecked power doesn't just corrupt. It decays. It festers in the dark corners of the throne room until what sits on the seat of empire isn't a man but a mirror. One that reflects back every fear, every weakness, every desperate denial of the people who allow it to stay. And even centuries later, in a far more restrained and powdered court, another monarch was carefully rehearsing his own version of curated intimacy, not with violence, but with voyeurism. Not with gods, but with dresses. The court of England was about to see what happened when desire put on a wig and asked politely for a show. Charles II was opening the curtain. King Charles II of England. If ever there was a king who treated exile like a sabbatical and restoration like an extended after-party, it was Charles II. The merry monarch. They called him not out of affection, but out of thinly veiled exhaustion. His reign wasn't so much governed as choreographed, set to a backdrop of satin sheets, powdered wigs, and a rotating cast of women who blurred the line between mistress, muse, and minor government official. But to understand Charles, you have to understand what came before him, namely, the English Civil War, a period so humorless and puritanical that even dancing was frowned upon, and the idea of a theatre performance was treated like witchcraft. His father, Charles I, was beheaded, his family scattered. England, for a brief moment, flirted with the radical notion of a government that didn't answer to divine hormones. So when the monarchy was restored in 1660, and Charles II returned from exile in France, he did not come back with apologies or reform. He came back with French tailoring, a chronic disinterest in politics, and a libido so persistent it might as well have been listed in the royal budget. Charles II was not a warrior. He was not a philosopher king. He was a man who found his peace in the art of watching. According to those close to the court, he had a particular fondness for slow undressing, not done in private, not behind locked doors, but often orchestrated like a delicately unwrapped stage play. His mistresses, many of whom were actresses, were reportedly expected to perform this ritual with theatrical timing, soft lighting, and frequently food. Because for Charles, indulgence wasn't passive, it was interactive. Banquets blurred into burlesque. Lounges became stages. He enjoyed watching women peel away their corsets as he chewed on roasted pheasant, washed down with wine too expensive for Parliament to ever approve, not that they were asked. This wasn't just preference, it was policy. The Restoration Court became a haven for permissiveness. Morality, if it still existed, was outsourced to the church, which Charles politely ignored. His most famous mistress, Nell Gwyn, began her career as a fruit seller and actress, and ended it with noble titles, palaces, and a place in British folklore. She wasn't just his lover, she was his PR campaign. He paraded her through London with such regularity that the people began to see her not as scandal, but as spectacle, charming, witty, and openly acknowledged. When someone mistook her for a Catholic on the street, she reportedly shouted, I'm the Protestant whore, a line so iconic it belongs on a flag. But Charles's appetites weren't just personal, they became political liabilities. His court was criticized as a den of vice, filled with drinking, gambling, and a rotating door of silk-clad companions. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, none of whom could inherit the throne, but many of whom were given dukedoms, incomes, and influence. The House of Lords became something of a daycare for his romantic decisions. And yet, for all his scandal, Charles was popular, almost suspiciously so. Why? Because after decades of Puritan austerity and the cold mechanics of parliamentary governance, the people didn't want virtue. They wanted personality. And Charles delivered not through laws, but through leisure. He ruled like a man who had read every line of Hamlet and decided the real tragedy wasn't indecision, but celibacy. But his indulgences came at a cost. The treasury bled. The plague swept through London. The Great Fire devoured half the city. And still, Charles lingered in his chambers, entertained by dancers and distractions, draped in the illusion that pleasure could outpace consequence. He was a voyeur of his own kingdom, watching it burn, slowly, from the safety of lace pillows and sugared fruit. And when he died, famously muttering, "Let not poor Nelly starve," it was less a final romantic gesture and more a punchline. The king who had turned the English court into a theatre of flirtation was undone, not by war or rebellion, but by the quiet inevitability of time. And yet, just as the English crown exhaled and tried to pretend the velvet curtain had closed for good, another ruler from a very different empire was already drawing the bath, lighting the incense, and preparing his own version of ceremonial indulgence. Not in courtrooms, but in bathhouses. Not with mistresses, but with pages. Shah Abbas, I was stepping into the steam. Shah Abbas, I of Persia. If Charles II turned voyeurism into entertainment, Shah Abbas, I transformed intimacy into ceremony. And not the kind of ceremony with priests and choirs. The kind with rosewater, gold-plated basins, and a room full of silent witnesses pretending not to notice what they were witnessing. Ruling from 1588 to 1629, Shah Abbas was, to most historians, a reformer, a consolidator, a centralizer of power. A man who modernized the Safavid Empire and turned Persia into a polished machine of governance, trade, and diplomacy. And all of that is true, but it leaves something out. Something that only surfaces when you peer past the palace gates and into the domed, dimly lit sanctuaries of his bathhouses. Because that's where Shah Abbas's real policies were made. Not in the court, but in the steam. At first glance, it all looked respectable. Bathhouses or hammams were sacred spaces in Persian culture, centers of cleanliness, health, and spirituality. But under Abbas, they became something else entirely, a performance space where bodies were washed, politics were softened, and boundaries, social, sensual, and otherwise, were deliberately erased. The Shah's favourite attendants were not ministers or scholars, but young pages selected, trained, perfumed. They were not just there to scrub the emperor's back, they were part of an aesthetic, a curated experience. They moved through steam like dancers, oiled and silent, trained in precise rituals of service. There were no accidents in a bathhouse run by Abbas, only choreography. And within this choreography, Shah Abbas began to shape something deeper, a kind of private theology, one that didn't quite follow the Islamic law he outwardly upheld, but operated in its own quiet domain. He wasn't flamboyant like Caligula or erratic like Elagabalus. He was disciplined, controlled, chillingly so. He would enter the bath in silence, no guards, no scribes, just scent jasmine, saffron, citrus thick in the air, and the boys, always in place. One would pour, one would massage, one would recite poetry. And Abbas, regal in silence, would watch, listen, and on rare occasions engage, not just with touch, with control. He used these rituals not to escape the pressures of power, but to reinforce them, to test loyalty, to reward obedience, to observe without speaking. These weren't just moments of personal pleasure. They were rehearsals for how he governed the entire empire through layered performance, subtle coercion, and a talent for making submission look like devotion. It's said that Abbas would sometimes stage elaborate games in the hammam reenactments of military campaigns, dramatic readings of Sufi mysticism, even mock parliaments. Pages were made to act out roles: soldiers, enemies, lovers, traitors. And always, the Shah watched from the pool, wrapped in silk, a ghost of divine judgment in human form. He wasn't interested in scandal, he was interested in order. Every touch, every gesture, every flick of the hand was part of a deeper pattern of discipline. And yet the rumours still crept through the marble corridors that the Shah's favourite pages were elevated beyond reason, that appointments to the court were sometimes made not by merit, but by the softness of a gaze. That generals resented being outranked by adolescent cupbearers. But no one challenged it, because to challenge Abbas was to challenge the only thing holding Persia together. He had no time for rebellion. He exiled his sons, blinded rivals, and executed ministers when they ceased to entertain him. But in the bathhouse, no one screamed, no one rebelled. They obeyed, soaked in silence, until they were dismissed or disappeared. And when he died, Persia wept, not for the rituals, but for the illusion of control he so meticulously crafted. The bathhouses stayed open. The pages stayed trained, but the choreography grew hollow. Without Abbas, it was just steam. And far to the east, another emperor was already sketching his own vision of intimate power, not in hammams, but on scrolls. Not through discipline, but through painted fantasy. Huizong of Song China was about to turn his palace into a gallery of desire. Emperor Huizong of Song China. In the great catalogue of emperors who lost empires while distracted by art, few fell as gracefully or as decadently as Emperor Huizong of Song China. He didn't rage like Caligula, didn't parade like Charles, and didn't punish like Abbas. He painted. He composed poetry. He built gardens designed to imitate the landscapes of myths. And while the frontiers of his empire buckled under the weight of foreign invasions, Huizong was somewhere deep in the palace, deciding whether an inkwash looked more evocative in pale cinnabar or bone black. He was, by many standards, a genius. A true polymath. Calligraphy, music theory, floral arrangement, all mastered. But this mastery came at a cost. Huizong didn't merely rule a palace. He curated it, transformed it into an enormous aesthetic experiment, where governance was almost an afterthought, and beauty itself became a form of obsession. And nowhere was that obsession more on display than in his approach to desire. Huizong didn't storm through history as a violent pervert or flamboyant libertine. He preferred elegance. He preferred nuance. He preferred things illustrated. Under his reign, the imperial court became a kind of living erotica anthology, equal parts literary salon and private theatre. He had an entire division within the palace dedicated to the production of erotic art scrolls, paintings, silken panels not crude but exquisitely detailed. Each scene was a narrative, each body a brushstroke. These weren't just for idle viewing. They were scripts. Huizong reportedly used them not as fantasy, but as instruction directing concubines to reenact specific poses, moods, even facial expressions. Every room in his palace became a chamber stage with lighting, props, and costuming to match the scroll in his hand. He turned intimacy into performance and himself into both audience and director. But the emperor didn't stop at performance. His taste demanded participation. He was known to compose musical scores to accompany specific bedroom rituals, treating them like operatic scenes, complete with rhythm, mood, and emotional arc. Court musicians were sometimes required to play just outside the curtain. The imperial bedroom, under Huizong, was a production poetic, methodical, unnervingly beautiful. And yet, for all the elegance, there was something distinctly clinical about it all. Huizong's women, and there were many, were often chosen for their resemblance to characters in ancient poems or historical dramas. Some were trained for months to mimic the movements of legendary figures. Others were selected for their ability to strike a certain silhouette against a lantern-lit screen. Intimacy was not personal. It was symbolic, aesthetic, sometimes indistinguishable from the art that adorned the palace walls. Even the emperor's garden was designed with erotic possibility in mind. Bridges shaped like crescents, trees planted to echo certain verses from Tang Dynasty love poetry, artificial hills constructed so that one could observe the way robes fall from the shoulder under moonlight. Huizong didn't desire women. He desired the concept of desire filtered, framed, and exquisitely staged. But outside the palace gates, the world was cracking. The Jin dynasty, fierce and ambitious, pressed down from the north. Ministers begged Huizong to focus. Generals warned of breaches. But the emperor, ever detached, ever poetic, dismissed their concerns with calligraphic grace. The ink on his scrolls dried faster than his empire could hold its borders. Eventually, it fell. The capital was captured. Huizong, along with many members of his court, was taken prisoner. The man who had once ruled an empire of poetry now found himself reduced to a footnote in another man's ledger. It said he continued to paint even in captivity small birds, lonely branches, brief moments of silence in a life that had been composed entirely of them. But his real legacy wasn't in his scrolls or his compositions. It was in the way he treated desire not as appetite, not even as identity, but as architecture, as something to be built, curated, and admired from a distance. And while Huizong painted through his downfall, in another continent entirely, a king with a far less refined palate was rifling through other people's laundry. Not because he was curious, because he was obsessed. King Farouk of Egypt was about to make fetish into foreign policy. King Farouk of Egypt. When people talk about the final kings of fallen dynasties, they often imagine broken men dethroned by revolution, betrayed by their people, dragging fading bloodlines behind them like dusty robes. But King Farouk of Egypt didn't go out like that. He went out like a man caught red-handed in someone else's lingerie drawer, because, well, he often was. Farouk ruled from 1936 to 1952, a period where Egypt was shifting under the tectonic pressure of colonial residue, nationalist awakenings, and growing unrest. But while the world turned, Farouk turned inward to obsession, to compulsion, to collecting. He didn't merely indulge, he stockpiled, he hoarded. Not land or power those he let slip through his fingers. No, Farouk collected objects, specifically women's undergarments. According to palace insiders and a growing cloud of rumors that followed him from hotel rooms to diplomatic dinners, Farouk had an uncontrollable fixation on stealing lingerie, even from the wives of his own guests. Nothing was sacred. Not social rank, not political alliances, not the concept of basic privacy. Visiting dignitaries were warned, discreetly, to keep an eye on their wives' luggage. And still, under the gold and green opulence of royal hospitality, silk would go missing, lace would vanish, drawers would be emptied like treasure chests. This wasn't casual perversion, this was logistics. Farouk reportedly kept an enormous collection of women's undergarments in hidden compartments throughout his palaces, categorized, preserved, archived. The way some kings keep medals or maps, Farouk kept brassieres. They weren't tokens of conquest, they were fetishes of absence. Objects removed from context, stored like trophies. But trophies of what? Not of love, not even of lust. Of control, maybe. Or perhaps a kind of curated fantasy, a world where the king didn't need to be admired, only obeyed in silence. But his obsessions didn't end in the bedroom. Farouk was addicted to acquisition in all forms. He devoured food with manic excess, consuming banquets meant for 20 in a single sitting. He gorged on chocolate, foie gras, and alcohol, until his body swelled into grotesque caricature, once slim and handsome, now barrel-like and waddling, wrapped in tailored suits stretched to their limits. He collected coins, watches, rare stamps, vintage cars, dozens, hundreds, stashed in garages while the streets of Cairo crumbled under poverty. And yet, even as the people starved, the king kept eating and stealing and indulging. He fancied himself a modern monarch, but had the emotional restraint of a kleptomaniac in a jewelry store. At one point, he reportedly stole a pocket watch off Winston Churchill, an act so bold, so cartoonishly bizarre, that it briefly overshadowed an entire diplomatic conversation. When confronted, Farouk laughed. "It's just a game," he said. But the game was always rigged, and the stakes were always real for everyone except him. Egypt, meanwhile, was no longer playing. As the king's scandals piled up, so did the dissent. Students protested, the army muttered, Parliament tried, uselessly, to leash him. But Farouk couldn't be leashed. He could only be distracted. He lived as though he was starring in a private noir fantasy, the suave anti-hero who slips into women's rooms and disappears with their secrets. But in reality, he was more voyeur than villain, less Casanova, more compulsive thief in a palace built of denial. When the revolution finally came in 1952, it was almost anticlimactic. The free officers gave him the choice: abdicate and leave, or be removed. Farouk, bloated and bewildered, packed his things. Not all of them, of course. There wasn't enough time to bring the lingerie vault. He boarded a yacht and sailed into exile, reportedly with suitcases filled with money, watches, and who knows what else. He would live out his remaining years in Europe, an overfed ghost in luxury hotels, wandering corridors that echoed not with power, but with whispers of silk and shame. But even in disgrace, Farouk remains unforgettable, not because of what he built, but because of what he took. A king who ruled through possession, through appetite, through a need so bottomless it became pathological. And while Farouk faded into Mediterranean obscurity, another royal far from Cairo, far from scandal headlines, was quietly summoning spirits, burning candles, and summoning visions not from politics, but from shadows. Because Frederick William II of Prussia didn't just rule with a scepter, he ruled with a seance. King Frederick William II of Prussia. Some monarchs use faith to justify war, others use it to comfort their subjects. King Frederick William II of Prussia used it to organize orgies. He was never meant to live in anyone's shadow, least of all that of his infamous predecessor Frederick the Great, a rigid, intellectual titan who disdained emotion and ruled with ice in his veins. But his nephew and successor, Frederick William II, was of a different breed entirely. Where the elder Frederick saw power as a burden, the younger one saw it as an invitation to indulge, to spiritualize his lusts, and to hide them in candlelit ceremonies that he insisted were for the soul. But the soul, apparently, had very specific tastes. Frederick William II ruled Prussia from 1786 to 1797, a decade marked not only by political maneuvering and territorial expansion, but by the emperor's curious preoccupation with mysticism, ritual, and what might generously be called esoteric pleasures. He was not content with traditional courtly affairs or casual dalliances. His bedroom, like his throne, had to be sanctified, or at least theatrically staged, to look that way. He was obsessed with the occult, surrounding himself with mediums, visionaries, and alchemists. The line between seance and seduction didn't just blur, it collapsed entirely. Secret societies flourished under his protection, filled with cryptic hand gestures, arcane symbols, and deeply suspicious initiation rites involving candles, chanting, and selective undressing. Some whispered that his most trusted advisors were not ministers, but magicians hired more for their ability to summon spirits than to balance budgets. His court became a kind of Versailles meets Vatican fever dream, where foreign policy might be interrupted at any moment for a spontaneous ritual invoking the lost wisdom of Atlantis. But the real ceremonies happened in private. It was said that Frederick William hosted exclusive spiritual circles with his most trusted companions, gatherings that began as philosophical salons and ended as scenes better suited to fevered novels. Women and men were both invited. The rooms were perfumed, lit with dim lanterns, and draped in veils that turned even the air into something suggestive. There were rules, of course. All sacred rituals have them. Participants were required to wear specific garments, flowing robes, or nothing at all, depending on the phase of the ritual. Incantations were recited, music was played, touch became meditation, and Frederick William, ever the spiritual leader, would preside from the center, not with judgment, but with fervent curiosity. He wasn't just present, he was orchestrating. He saw no contradiction between desire and divinity. To him, these acts weren't merely indulgent, they were sacred. Divine pleasure, enlightenment through ecstasy. Every embrace was a mystical union. Every sigh, a hymn. That was the justification, anyway. Meanwhile, Prussia staggered forward under the weight of its leader's distractions. The king spent lavishly on temples, exotic perfumes, and personal sanctuaries where his rituals could unfold uninterrupted. The court grew nervous. The military, more accustomed to boots than barefoot prophets, grew restless. Frederick William's attention, like his affections, was unpredictable. He was famously indecisive, particularly when dealing with the affairs of state. A man who could orchestrate a night-long ritual involving scented oils, carved obsidian, and synchronized breathwork, and yet be utterly paralyzed by a diplomatic treaty. His spiritual advisors often had more say in royal appointments than his generals. His personal astrologer reportedly vetoed more policies than his cabinet. Eventually, it all began to unravel. The French Revolution was burning down thrones. The world was tilting toward modernity. Frederick William, garlanded in incense smoke and half-whispered mantras, found himself increasingly out of step. By the time he died in 1797, Prussia was already shifting away from the dreamscape he had crafted. His successor dismantled many of his sacred societies and purged the court of the mystics and moonlit ministers. The temples were closed, the candles snuffed out. But the memory lingered. A king who tried to transform governance into alchemy, who baptized his appetites in sacred oils, who believed that the state could be seduced into harmony one ritual at a time. And far across the continent, in another empire soaked in spice, silk, and opium, a different ruler was combining performance, power, and spectacle, but this time with animals, dancers, and an appetite that disturbed even his contemporaries. Jahangir of Mughal India wasn't just an emperor, he was an audience. Emperor Jahangir of Mughal India. If Shah Abbas moved through steam and Frederick William drifted through incense, Emperor Jahangir of Mughal India moved through smoke thick, perfumed, and always curling around some forbidden curiosity. Ruler of one of the richest empires in the world, from 1605 to 1627, Jahangir styled himself as the patron of art, justice, and opium-dusted contemplation. And yet, behind the meticulously painted miniatures and the glassy-eyed poetry, there was something else happening. Something more elaborate, more theatrical. Something that would leave even his own courtiers quietly disturbed. Jahangir didn't conquer, he curated. While his father Akbar had built an empire through military brilliance and religious diplomacy, Jahangir inherited a finished palace and filled it with shadows. He didn't need to expand the empire. He needed to decorate it with rare animals, exquisite fabrics, intoxicating substances, and performances that blurred the line between entertainment and exhibitionism. Publicly, he was a lover of nature. He kept journals filled with obsessive detail about flora and fauna, watched animals with the reverence of a scholar, and commissioned hundreds of paintings of birds, lions, elephants, deer. But that affection wasn't always innocent. Behind the artistic fascination with animals lay a darker performance ethic, one that incorporated these creatures into highly choreographed spectacles. At court banquets and private festivals, Jahangir would stage elaborate entertainments where dancers, musicians, and trained animals performed together in what can only be described as living tableau. The dancers were handpicked, many of them barely more than girls, adorned in silver bells and translucent silk, trained in stylized movements meant to echo the behavior of animals. One might crawl like a tiger, another slink like a serpent. Some performances involved literal animals, released into the space mid-dance, blurring the metaphor entirely. The emperor would sit in an elevated pavilion, surrounded by cushions, opium pipes, and a rotating court of favorites, observing in silence. He didn't clap, he didn't speak. He simply watched, expressionless, as court dancers weaved around leopards and falcons under moonlight, their routines measured to the sound of flutes and the rustle of gold-threaded skirts. Some of these acts were said to have crossed into territory that no one dared describe plainly. Foreign visitors, whose reports somehow escaped Mughal censorship, wrote of erotic animal mimicry so unsettling, even seasoned courtiers turned away. Dancers trained to emulate mating rituals of beasts, performers contorted into shapes that served both symbolic and salacious ends, all presented under the pretense of imperial culture. Jahangir justified these events in philosophical terms. He saw no contradiction between aestheticism and indulgence. In his eyes, the body was just another medium, like marble or pigment, and pleasure when executed with grace was as valid as poetry or music. Morality, to Jahangir, was provincial. What mattered was beauty, and beauty, for him, required control. And control he maintained. His palace operated like a theatrical company. Everyone had roles. Dancers were trained like soldiers. Animal handlers were choreographers. Eunuchs acted as stage managers, timing the transitions between music, incense, and spectacle. The emperor oversaw it all, from a chaise of sandalwood and ivory, too intoxicated to move, too lucid to miss a detail. This was not madness, it was method. Even his approach to punishment echoed his aesthetic. Criminals weren't simply executed, they were paraded, displayed, used as visual warnings to the disobedient. And just as he adorned his court with sensual ceremony, he used brutality as theatre. Pleasure and punishment existed on the same stage, back to back, separated only by costuming. Yet, for all his control, Jahangir often seemed haunted. In his later years, bloated by addiction and paranoia, he began to retreat into fantasy. The performances became more elaborate, more surreal, as if he were trying to disappear into them. The dancers grew younger, the animals more exotic, the court more silent. Ministers began to wonder if they were serving an emperor or an audience that no longer clapped. And as the empire began to buckle under its own weight, his son Shah Jahan waited in the wings, blade sharp, gaze colder than any poem could soften. But the stage of imperial pleasure never closed it, merely relocated. Centuries later, in a far more gilded France, another ruler would recreate the empire of indulgence. But this time, the dancers were younger, the audience smaller, and the secrecy more deliberate. Because Louis XV didn't throw festivals, he built an entire house for his desires. King Louis XV of France. By the time Louis XV came to power, France had already perfected the art of masking decay in velvet. The court at Versailles shimmered with chandeliers, powdered faces, and diplomacy that smelled like perfume and rotted from within. But Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, took this contradiction and distilled it into something far more intimate. Less about grandeur, more about control. Less public theatre, more private choreography. He was crowned in 1722, still a boy, soft-eyed and easily moulded. But that boy became a man whose desires were not erratic like Caligula's or theatrical like Jahangir's. They were deliberate, organized, systematized. He didn't flirt with scandal, he structured it. The apex of that structure was a place known in hushed tones and veiled references, the Parc aux Cerfs. Literally, the Deer Park. A quaint name for what amounted to a state-funded pleasure compound nestled quietly near Versailles. While the palace entertained diplomats, the Deer Park entertained the king. This was not a brothel. That word would be too crude for Louis's sensibilities. The king required something more refined, a private residence designed to house young women, selected, groomed, and kept in seclusion for his personal indulgence. Discretion was key. The women were not paraded or boasted about. They were moved in and out of the house through back corridors, cloaked carriages, and servants who had been trained not to speak above a whisper. Most were teenagers, some shockingly young, even by the standards of the 18th century girls from modest families, often selected through intermediaries who promised wealth, stability, even marriage. What they got was a gilded cage, luxurious, yes, full of books, music, fine gowns, and tutors. But make no mistake, the curriculum was singular. They were there to please the king. Louis would visit unannounced, cloaked in informality. There were no royal processions, no trumpets. Just the soft creak of a carriage door, the quiet tap of heels on the stone path, and then the king casually entering a room where everything had been staged to his liking. Fragrance, lighting, mood. The girl, waiting. And yet, he believed it was all gentle. To Louis, this arrangement wasn't exploitation. It was kindness. He treated the girls well, in the sense that they were not beaten, not discarded without compensation. He paid dowries when they left, arranged marriages to lower nobles, gave pensions to those who bore him children. He convinced himself and his closest advisers that he was not a predator, but a patron, a protector, a romantic. This delusion was enabled by layers of court etiquette designed to insulate power from accountability. The nobles didn't object. They were too busy with their own affairs, too afraid to lose access. The church looked away, preferring to criticize Enlightenment thinkers instead. And the people heard whispers. They saw the bills. But they were too crushed by famine and taxes to mount anything more than gossip. As Louis aged, the arrangement became grotesque in its efficiency. He no longer sought pleasure, he required it. It became routine, bureaucratic. His mistress-in-chief, Madame de Pompadour, brilliant, cultured, and past her years of sexual influence, was said to have managed some of the recruitment herself. Not out of jealousy, but practicality. The king still needed stimulation. France still needed stability. One was dependent on the illusion of the other. But the illusion was cracking. The coffers were draining. The people were restless. And behind the golden walls of Versailles, the king was aging slower, heavier, more isolated. His appetite persisted, even as his empire sagged under its own ornamental weight. When Louis XV died in 1774, he left behind not a kingdom, but a slow-motion disaster. A nation spiraling toward revolution, fueled in part by decades of royal indulgence masquerading as divine right. His heir, Louis XVI, would face the guillotine. But the legacy of Louis XV remained not just in the scandal of the Deer Park, but in the quiet terror it represented. That power, when hidden too long in luxury, forgets what it looks like in daylight. And far across the sea, in a nation just beginning to modernize, another emperor had already begun staging his own twilight entertainments, not in palaces, but in carefully crafted tea rooms, behind paper screens, where staged pleasure passed for refinement. Emperor Meiji was not decadent. He was meticulous. And he watched everything. Emperor Meiji of Japan. In the history books, Emperor Meiji is remembered as the man who dragged Japan into the modern world, who traded swords for steam engines, samurai for soldiers, kimonos for khakis. A reformer. A national unifier. The emperor who cracked open the sealed box of Japanese isolation and let in the scent of Western ambition. But history, as always, edits out the parts that smell too human. Because while the public Meiji was busy restructuring Japan's legal code and modeling his court after European monarchies, the private Meiji was exploring another kind of theatre altogether, one performed not in parliaments or palaces, but in tightly curated chambers behind paper doors. And unlike the bureaucratic rituals of the West, these performances weren't written into the record. They were whispered, lacquered, and rehearsed with the precision of a no-play no outsider was ever meant to see. His imperial court, stripped of the shogun's military dominance, became something else, a controlled, aesthetic ecosystem where political power was indistinguishable from social choreography. Everything mattered: how you bowed, how you folded a letter, how you poured the tea. But beneath this performance of order, Meiji built an inner world of indulgence, carefully veiled by protocol and obscured by incense. At the center of that world were the women, geisha, concubines, handmaidens, and the rituals he staged around them. Meiji didn't command orgies or force decadence, he orchestrated theater. The emperor's private quarters were more than luxurious. They were designed a soft labyrinth of tatami, silk screens, and painted fans, where the passage of time was marked by the slow drip of water from carved stone basins. Here, pleasure was not spontaneous. It was art-directed. He would summon geisha, not for companionship, but for performance. Not songs or dances, though those were expected, but staged intimacy. Reenactments, scripts. These were not acts of raw appetite, they were rituals. The women were chosen not just for beauty, but for timing, subtlety, restraint. Everything was slow. Every movement had a rhythm. The untying of a sash could take minutes. A single hairpin might be removed like a ceremonial object, and the emperor would sit, perfectly still, watching. Always watching. He rarely touched, or if he did, it was after hours of performance, and even then, with an almost academic detachment. The act itself, when it happened, seemed less about passion and more about narrative. He wanted to see a story, a role, a historical fantasy, a personal ghost. The women were made to embody figures from poetry, folklore, or distant eras of Japanese nobility. They became symbols. They became time travel. And the emperor, in turn, became a voyeur not of bodies, but of archetypes. One court rumor circulated cautiously among lower attendants described a recurring performance involving two geisha in the roles of rival clanswomen. The emperor would watch as they acted out a centuries-old feud, exchanging lines from classical theatre while slowly disrobing each other. There was no climax. Only ritualized resentment melting into staged forgiveness, all beneath the flicker of oil lamps. This wasn't hedonism. It was something colder, more abstract. Meiji didn't indulge in desire. He dissected it, broke it down into poses, movements, tones. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was control. Either way, no one questioned it. Not in a Japan still defining itself in the new global order. The emperor was modernizing the nation, after all, introducing railroads, factories, foreign advisors. A few strange rituals behind closed doors seemed like a small price to pay for industrial rebirth. And yet, that duality, the reformer in public, the director in private, left a mark. It shaped the imperial court for decades. Taught future rulers how to separate face from function, how to keep one hand on the constitution while the other adjusted the lighting in a shadowed tea room. And while Meiji passed quietly into legend, a man who built the scaffolding of modern Japan, another king, half a world away, was slipping into his own empire of appetites. Less quiet, less patient. A man who didn't choreograph desire. He galloped straight into it, because King Pedro I of Brazil didn't want to watch the play. He wanted to be the scandal. King Pedro I of Brazil. Some monarchs bury their appetites in layers of ritual. Others hide behind incense, ceremony, or metaphysical pretense. King Pedro I of Brazil didn't bother with any of that. He charged through the palace doors like a man already mid-affair, trousers askew, half laughing, half daring anyone to stop him. He wasn't elegant, he wasn't subtle. He was Brazil's first emperor, and from the moment he declared independence in 1822, Pedro treated the throne like a prop in a never-ending personal opera. Part revolution, part romance, and part full-blown farce. Where his father Zhao VI had ruled Portugal with the cautious paranoia of a man always waiting for a coup, Pedro ruled Brazil with the erratic energy of someone who didn't believe consequences were real. He was passionate, impulsive, and spectacularly undisciplined. And when it came to his personal life, Pedro wasn't scandalous in the way of French kings or Roman emperors. He was scandalous in a way that felt improvisational. Like he was making it up as he went along, and just happened to drag the monarchy with him. His appetite for women was notorious not in number alone, but in the sheer chaos it brought to court life. He had lovers in every corner of the palace, in broom closets, in music rooms, in the imperial kitchens. But more curious than his compulsive conquests was his habit of attaching elaborate theatrics to them. Pedro didn't just seduce, he performed. He was known to engage in intimate acts during elaborate feasts, hidden barely behind draped curtains while musicians played and courtiers politely pretended not to hear. Servants would bring in platters of exotic fruit mid-scene, which he used not only as snacks, but as props. Mangoes, melons, guavas all became instruments in Pedro's impromptu culinary carnal theatre. The rumour that he once involved a full roasted pig in one of his rendezvous was likely apocryphal, but not entirely out of character. He didn't seem to care if anyone saw. Or maybe he wanted them to. There was a strange, almost childlike glee in the way he scandalized his own court. He didn't cultivate privacy. He weaponized attention. And in doing so, he made his court a place of constant unease, not because it was cruel or violent, but because it was unstable. You never knew if you were walking into a diplomatic meeting or an unscheduled cabaret. The women he took as lovers, many of them married to noblemen, foreign diplomats, or his own advisors, were quickly elevated, publicly favored, and just as quickly discarded. Except for one, Domitila de Castro, the Marchioness of Santos. She wasn't just a mistress, she was practically a co-ruler. Pedro gave her estates, titles, servants, and a palace of her own just blocks from the royal residence. Ministers referred to her as Her Highness behind closed doors, partly in mockery, partly in fear. Domitila accompanied Pedro to public events, signed royal correspondence, and had his child all while his actual wife, Empress Maria Leopoldina, was tucked quietly out of sight, grieving, humiliated, and ultimately dying under suspiciously tragic circumstances. Some said heartbreak, others said illness. Most understood the line between them was blurry. Pedro, of course, mourned her death with the enthusiasm of a theatre actor in a third-rate tragedy, then promptly resumed his usual habits. But even the emperor's recklessness had limits. As political tensions rose and Brazil's fragile independence began to splinter under the weight of his erratic leadership, Pedro's distractions began to catch up with him. His love of theatre, in bed, in court, in every corner of life, began to make him look unserious, unfit, unstable. By 1831, the pressure snapped. Facing growing opposition and riots in the streets, Pedro abdicated the Brazilian throne in favor of his 5-year-old son and sailed back to Portugal, where he tried to reinvent himself as a noble warrior and constitutionalist. It didn't work. His reputation preceded him, as did his appetites. He died young, just 35, his body worn down by excess and fever, his legacy somewhere between revolutionary and embarrassment. And while Brazil moved on, its scandal-wreathed emperor left behind a blueprint for royal chaos, a model of power that wasn't structured, wasn't sacred, and certainly wasn't sober. But not every ruler needed mangoes and mistresses. Some preferred gears, paintings, machines that moved like bodies. Because in the shadowed halls of the Holy Roman Empire, another emperor had turned curiosity into a collection not of lovers, but of objects. Rudolf II didn't want people. He wanted toys. Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire. By all appearances, Emperor Rudolf II was a man out of time, a figure better suited to the dusty corners of a curiosity shop than the golden halls of empire. Ruling from Prague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Rudolf wasn't your typical emperor. He had no real interest in war, none in diplomacy, and only the barest patience for politics. What he craved was strangeness, the exotic, the arcane, the erotic, the absurd, And when you're the Holy Roman Emperor, you can afford to collect all four at once. His castle became less a seat of government and more a labyrinth of obsessions. Prague, under his rule, was less an imperial capital than a shrine to everything humanity considered beautiful, bizarre, or profane. Astrologers, alchemists, philosophers, artists, heretics, they all passed through Rudolf's court like moths circling a chandelier that pulsed with gold, dust, and mystery. And in the middle of it all sat Rudolf himself, pale, reclusive, increasingly mad, surrounded not by courtiers or generals, but by objects. He amassed one of the largest collections of erotic art in Europe, not tucked away in some private vault, but often displayed proudly among his other curiosities. Paintings of lovers locked in anatomically improbable embraces hung beside celestial globes and preserved mythical beasts in jars. His Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, was a museum of human desire, myth, and flesh. He treated sexuality the same way he treated science and philosophy, as something to be studied, catalogued, and, when possible, mechanized. Enter the automata. Rudolf had a fascination with mechanical sex toys complex, handcrafted devices made of silver, brass, and leather, reportedly capable of motions that suggested far more than a mere tick of the clock. These weren't tools of private whimsy. These were trophies, conversation starters, and, according to some court accounts, the centerpiece of late-night demonstrations that blurred the line between science and spectacle. The emperor would invite selected guests, nobles, artists, and sometimes bewildered foreign envoys into private salons where these devices were displayed, sometimes operated by hand, sometimes by clockwork, often accompanied by philosophical musings about the nature of pleasure, the mechanics of the soul, or the folly of the flesh. There were rumors, never confirmed, but persistently repeated that certain automata were modeled after lovers, both male and female, with articulated limbs and interchangeable parts. If it sounds like a theater of madness, that's because it was. But Rudolf didn't see it as madness. He saw it as curiosity refined, as enlightenment made tangible. To him, a mechanical lover was no different from a telescope or an astrolabe, just another tool for understanding the human condition. He commissioned dozens of paintings of mythological seductions, many of which bordered on the surreal. Leda and the Swan, Europa and the Bull, Danae and the Golden Rain. These weren't religious or educational depictions. They were excuses, pretexts for exploring the boundaries of erotic imagination under the safe cover of allegory. And when paintings weren't enough, he turned to live performance. There are accounts, some credible, some embroidered with time of private viewings, where selected performers reenacted these myths in elaborate costumes and golden masks. The emperor watched silently, surrounded by relics, each scene treated with the seriousness of a scientific lecture. He did not participate. He observed, he took notes, he whispered instructions. Some say he sketched. But even an empire built on dreams and curiosities must eventually wake up. Rudolf's neglect of political duty allowed rebellions to spread and the empire to fracture. His mental health deteriorated. He became paranoid, withdrawn, convinced that enemies lurked among his own collections. He locked himself in the castle, surrounded by mechanical lovers and fading scrolls of alchemical promise. Eventually, his brother deposed him, not in a violent coup, but in a quiet, clinical sweep. The man who once ruled over the spiritual, artistic, and sensual heart of Europe died alone, surrounded not by advisors or children, but by paintings that no longer moved, devices that had wound down, and echoes that sounded too much like laughter. But even as Rudolf's empire dissolved, his legacy lingered a reminder that when power becomes obsessed with understanding pleasure, it often ends up trapped inside its own imagination. And far to the north, another ruler sat alone in his palace, not surrounded by art, but haunted by obsession. His pleasure wasn't aesthetic or philosophical. It was compulsive, uncontrollable, publicly embarrassing. King Christian VII of Denmark wasn't searching for meaning. He was simply trying to stop. King Christian VII of Denmark. Of all the monarchs who spiraled under the weight of their own appetites, King Christian VII of Denmark may be the most tragically transparent. Not because he was cruel, or lecherous, or flamboyant, but because, unlike the emperors who turned their desires into theatre, Christian never managed to disguise his compulsions. He didn't wield pleasure like a weapon or dress it up in allegory. He just couldn't stop. When Christian ascended the throne in 1766 at the age of 17, Denmark had no idea what kind of king it had inherited. Handsome, intelligent, and seemingly fit to rule. He offered all the promise of youth, but beneath the royal polish, there was something unstable already unraveling. A nervous energy, an erratic cadence, a childlike awkwardness that made his court flinch without quite knowing why. Soon, they would know. Christian had a problem. A simple, deeply human problem taken to a royal extreme. He was compulsively obsessed with self-gratification, and not in some metaphorical poetic way. Literally, constantly, openly, in court, during council meetings, at state dinners. Ministers would be mid-sentence when the young king, lost in his own world, would drift away physically, mentally, and alarmingly often, manually. At first, courtiers laughed it off. "Boys will be boys," they whispered. But Christian was not a boy anymore. He was king, and kings are not supposed to interrupt military briefings with audible moans. What followed was a slow descent into public embarrassment, punctuated by diplomatic incidents that would be hilarious if they weren't so sad. Ambassadors wrote back to their governments with increasingly surreal accounts of royal behavior. The French envoy described the king as animated by invisible puppeteers. The British ambassador called him a child in a man's costume, governed by impulses no one dares name. Attempts were made to correct the problem. Christian was assigned a wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain herself, only 15 at the time, in the vain hope that marriage would stabilize him. It didn't. He ignored her almost immediately, preferring instead the comfort of his increasingly isolated rituals. Eventually, Christian's court brought in a new player, Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician and intellectual who quickly became the king's personal doctor, advisor, and, depending on which scandal sheet you believe, something even closer. Struensee recognized Christian's weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. Under Struensee's quiet manipulation, Christian became a puppet in a new performance. The doctor wrote royal decrees in the king's name, reformed the government, abolished torture, introduced Enlightenment ideas, all while Christian wandered the halls of Amalienborg Palace, muttering, pacing, and disappearing for hours at a time into empty rooms. Struensee, of course, took Christian's queen for himself not just as a lover, but as a partner in governance. The triangle was scandalous, but in a strange way, stabilizing. Denmark functioned, at least on paper. The king was still signing documents, still making appearances, still draped in silk and gold. But everyone knew who was really in charge. Then it unraveled as all covert arrangements eventually do. The aristocracy, enraged by Struensee's reforms and disgusted by his affair with the queen, plotted a coup. In 1772, the doctor was arrested and executed, his body publicly quartered in a display of royal rage pretending to be moral clarity. Caroline Matilda was exiled to Germany, separated from her children, disgraced for a crime everyone knew had filled a power vacuum the king himself had abandoned. And Christian? He stayed. But what returned after the purge was not a king. It was a shell. A man broken not by scandal, but by the exposure of what had always been true, that he was unfit to rule, unfit to resist, unfit to even maintain the illusion of authority. He remained on the throne for decades, in name only, while regents and advisors ran the country. He was rarely seen in public. Occasionally, rumours emerged of strange laughter in empty rooms, of dishevelled appearances, of royal garments soiled by compulsions he could no longer control or contain. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale. Because Christian VII didn't weaponize his desires, he didn't intellectualize them, he simply drowned in them, slowly, publicly, and with no one able to save him. And while Denmark tried to forget, another emperor, far across the continent, was engaging in fantasies of a different kind. Fantasies that involved elaborate costumes, staged enemies, and concubines dressed as villains. Emperor Yingzong of Ming China wasn't losing control. He was writing the script. Emperor Yingzong of Ming China. If the court of Christian VII was a haunted corridor of embarrassment, then the reign of Emperor Yingzong of Ming China was something more surreal, a masquerade of roleplay so elaborate that it stopped resembling indulgence and started looking like historical revisionism with wardrobe changes. Because where other rulers played out their fantasies in secret, Yingzong did so with the full resources of the imperial court and a costume budget that would put most modern film studios to shame. Yingzong ruled twice, first as a boy emperor from 1435 to 1449, and again as a restored ruler from 1457 to 1464. In both stints, he seemed more fascinated by theatre than by theory, more absorbed in pageantry than policy. He came to power young, surrounded by palace eunuchs, scholars, and Confucian advisors who hoped to mold him into the ideal son of heaven. But Yingzong, like many young monarchs given absolute control and nowhere to go, wandered instead into the boundless territory of imagination. And not just any imagination, his was strangely specific. He became obsessed with China's military history, particularly its long-standing enmity with nomadic tribes from the north, the Mongols, the Jurchens, the relics of old invasions that still haunted the collective psyche of the empire. But rather than processing these tensions through policy or diplomacy, Yingzong found a more immersive solution: reenactment. In the inner palace, an empire within the empire, he ordered concubines and eunuchs to dress as foreign invaders. Not in jest, but with the studied accuracy of a state-sponsored drama. He had researchers study old uniforms, dialects, battlefield chants. Silk and furs were tailored to resemble the coats of Mongol horsemen. He even had palace craftsmen forge weapons for authenticity, dulled of course, but disturbingly realistic. Then the battles would begin. Concubines would be summoned to the imperial chambers dressed as warriors, sometimes fierce enemies, sometimes captive generals, sometimes male roles entirely. Yingzong would watch from his throne, or from within the performance itself, playing roles that ranged from righteous emperor to captured commander, depending on his mood. Servants were expected to maintain character. Laughter was forbidden. It was all taken very seriously. Some nights, the performances veered into interrogation scenes. Yingzong, dressed in gold-threaded robes and donning the expression of a benevolent torturer, would question his enemies, testing their loyalty, their submission, their willingness to obey. If a concubine performed well, she was rewarded with silk, jewels, or promotions in court standing. If she broke character, she was dismissed. Not punished, this was still a game, but dismissed from the imperial theatre, which may have been worse. But the line between performance and governance blurred more than anyone was comfortable admitting. Yingzong began issuing edicts that referenced themes from these performances. He praised internal vigilance and condemned foreign sympathizers' coded language that paralleled the roles assigned to his concubines. At one point, he reportedly asked his generals to stage a mock battle in the royal gardens, complete with war drums and faux casualties. The generals complied, awkwardly, because what else can you do when your emperor wants cosplay with spears? Even more unnerving was the way these performances started bleeding into the rituals of court life. Banquets were interrupted for costumed interludes. Imperial meetings ended with theatrical summaries. Reports from ministers were returned with red ink notations correcting their narrative tension. All of it, in the emperor's mind, was about moral clarity. To Yingzong, these role plays weren't escapism, they were purification. By forcing his court to repeatedly defeat the image of the barbarian enemy, he believed he was exorcising China's trauma. But what he was really doing was feeding his own compulsion a need to reduce history into something he could control, costume, and command from a cushioned throne. Outwardly, he ruled with relative calm, but inwardly, the empire had become a script. His concubines were no longer women, they were archetypes. His decisions were no longer policies, they were scenes. And the throne was no longer a symbol of statehood, it was a director's chair. When Yingzong died in 1464, the roleplay ended abruptly. His successor, less interested in elaborate fantasy, dismantled the inner palace theatre and quietly destroyed many of the costumes. No records were kept, no plays preserved. It was as if the whole thing had been a dream, too embarrassing to admit had ever been real. But for 2 decades, China's most powerful man had treated his court like a personal stage, not to escape power, but to reenact it, over and over, in silken shadow. And while Yingzong's empire returned to reality, another monarch across the channel, across the century, across every imaginable cultural barrier, was preparing to escape it entirely. Because George IV of the United Kingdom didn't want to play a role. He wanted to wear the whole closet. King George IV of the United Kingdom. Some kings are remembered for battles, others for reform. George IV is remembered for his wardrobe. Not metaphorically, literally. His wardrobe was so large, so excessive, so detailed in its decadence that it occasionally overshadowed the rest of the monarchy, a monarchy that, under his watch, was already collapsing under debt, scandal, and the faint scent of lavender cologne. George IV ruled first as Prince Regent during the mental decline of his father, George III, and later as king from 1820 to 1830. But whether he was officially sovereign or merely cosplaying as one, he lived with the same philosophy. Restraint was for peasants, and style was power. While the empire strained to maintain control over its global holdings, George was busy hosting private soirees where the dress code often had less to do with status and more to do with transformation. He loved costumes, not just theatrical costumes, but total identity makeovers. His taste leaned heavily into cross-dressing, with entire evenings themed around royal women of history, mythological figures, or imagined foreign queens. He would appear, powdered and perfumed, in flowing gowns, tiaras perched over carefully curled wigs, surrounded by similarly dressed noblemen, many of whom found it wiser to play along than to protest. It wasn't a secret. It was a sensation. These weren't drunken college boy mockeries or bawdy carnival jokes. They were sincere performances, complete with full court musicians, carefully choreographed dances, and embroidered gowns that would take weeks to make, sometimes in the style of Queen Elizabeth I, sometimes Cleopatra, sometimes entirely invented feminine personas with elaborate backstories that George reportedly wrote himself. He once attended a masquerade dressed as a Roman empress, complete with breastplate molded to curve, not conquer, and sandals laced daintily up his calves. The onlookers, used to aristocratic eccentricities, still whispered. There were limits, even in Regency England, and George didn't just cross them. He waltzed across them, fanned himself, and asked for another glass of imported Tokaji wine. But behind the satin and spectacle was something deeper, a hunger for transformation that went beyond kink or rebellion. George IV was obsessed with image, because image was the only thing that ever loved him back. His relationships were a disaster. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a public humiliation on both sides, riddled with accusations, counter-accusations, and open hostility. He once tried to ban her from his own coronation and succeeded. He had lovers, yes, but very few lasting attachments. What he did have was fabric, powder, paint, and mirrors. He used his body like a canvas, and his palace like a wardrobe. He remodeled Carlton House multiple times just to suit his evolving tastes. When he finally commissioned the Brighton Pavilion, a seaside pleasure palace built in mock Orientalist style, complete with onion domes and lavish dragon motifs, it wasn't for politics, it was for ambience. The pavilion became a kind of imperial dollhouse, and George its most elaborately dressed occupant. He didn't hide from ridicule, he just pretended not to hear it. Meanwhile, the monarchy strained to justify its expense. The people grumbled. The parliament tightened the purse strings. And George, bloated by now, his body swollen with decades of excess, continued to don corsets under his military uniforms, not because he needed to impress, but because he needed to disappear into the character he had built. He once described himself as the first gentleman of Europe, with a seriousness that bordered on tragic. The reality was something far stranger, a man who wore majesty like drag, who used femininity not as rebellion, but as refuge. In perils he felt invincible, in gowns he felt briefly adored. When he died, he left behind a monarchy with a bruised reputation, a country relieved to turn the page, and closets filled with garments no future king dared to touch. But far from Britain's perfumed confusion, deep in the Persian court, another monarch was curating his own gallery of women not in dresses, but in photographs. Shah Naser al-Din Qajar didn't want to become the fantasy. He wanted to capture it. Shah Naser al-Din Qajar of Persia. There are kings who write poems, kings who lead armies, and kings who steal lingerie. Shah Naser al-Din Qajar of Persia didn't bother with any of that. He picked up a camera instead. Ruling from 1848 to 1896, Naser al-Din lived in a world already halfway modern, though his palace still echoed with the sound of ancient traditions. Persia was a place caught between centuries, somewhere between the Quran and the telegraph, between poetry and photography, between sacred modesty and soft focus indulgence. And right in the center of that historical Venn diagram stood the Shah, peering through a camera lens at women he had already conquered. He was fascinated by technology, not as a curiosity, but as a tool for power. He imported inventions from Europe, clocks, rifles, railways, and above all, cameras. It didn't take him long to realize that a camera was not just a machine for memory. It was a mirror he could control, a lens he could use to document not just history, but desire. And so he built a harem not just in the traditional sense, but as an aesthetic project. The Qajar harem was already massive by the time Naser al-Din took power, a sprawling network of wives, concubines, eunuchs, and servants sealed off from the world like a living tapestry. But he saw in it something more, a studio, a canvas. Under his rule, the women of the harem were not simply hidden, they were staged. He taught himself photography, and like any new artist armed with power and no editor, he began producing a deeply personal and politically delicate portfolio. He arranged his concubines in carefully composed portraits seated, standing, reclining, draped in Persian silks and European lace, bare ankles just peeking beneath embroidered hems. Sometimes they looked directly at the lens. Sometimes they looked away. Always, they looked like they didn't get a vote. These weren't salacious images by modern standards. There was no nudity, no overt provocation, but they were scandalous in their time, even within his own court. In a deeply Islamic society where the female body was expected to remain not just covered, but conceptually invisible, the idea that the Shah was taking private portraits of unveiled women and developing them in secret chambers was incendiary. Yet he continued. Some say he was documenting beauty. Others say he was documenting possession. He catalogued his harem like a collector cataloguing rare birds. Each woman had a name, a place, an expression. The photographs weren't just souvenirs of intimacy, they were extensions of it. Once captured, these women became images he could summon at will, study, compare, archive. Real bodies could age, rebel, grow tiresome. Images stayed still. He didn't just photograph his harem, he photographed himself with them. Sitting like a patron saint of longing, thick moustache curled, dagger sheathed at his hip, his gaze falling somewhere between melancholy and pride. These portraits, half propaganda, half confession, became his most private expression of power, not ruling from a throne, but from behind a lens. Meanwhile, the empire faltered. His reforms stalled. His people rebelled. Naser al-Din granted a constitution, then revoked it. He flirted with modernization, then retreated into nostalgia. But the harem remained, the camera remained, the fantasy remained. Toward the end of his reign, he took his camera on diplomatic trips to Europe. In Paris and London, he visited royal courts and theatres, absorbing the polite decadence of the West with an increasingly distracted gaze. He watched ballerinas the same way he photographed his concubines, as if performance and submission were interchangeable. One European observer noted that the Shah looked more like a weary artist than a sovereign. That may have been generous. He looked like a man trying to make memory obey him. In 1896, he was assassinated, shot point blank by a radical who believed Persia needed a real revolution, not one filtered through velvet and sepia tone. The Shah's last words, reportedly, were, "I am not feeling well." Understatement always has its moment, but his legacy, locked in fragile glass negatives and dusty palace albums, survived. The images were hidden, buried, sometimes destroyed, but they whispered of a man who tried to turn power into portraiture, who believed that if he arranged beauty just right, he could keep the world still. And far to the west, in a city built for violence and vanity, another emperor had also grown tired of stillness. He didn't want to stage desire. He wanted to gladiate it. Because Commodus of Rome didn't watch, he fought. Emperor Commodus of Rome. In the long line of Roman emperors who blurred the line between ruler and spectacle, Commodus didn't just erase the boundary, he shattered it with a blood-stained trident and a victorious grin. If Caligula turned power into theatre, Commodus turned it into a live-action deathmatch. And when he wasn't swinging swords in the Colosseum, he was staging fantasies behind palace walls that made the games outside look almost wholesome by comparison. He ruled from 180 to 192 CE, inheriting the throne from his father, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the Stoic, the symbol of Roman virtue. Commodus was none of those things. He wasn't philosophical, he wasn't virtuous, he was barely coherent. He was Rome's answer to the question, what if an Instagram influencer had absolute power and a weapons cache? But Commodus didn't just love attention. He needed it like oxygen. He saw the Roman Empire not as a responsibility, but as an audience. And every act of his reign, political, personal, sexual, was crafted with one goal: to be unforgettable. It started with his obsession with gladiators, not watching them, being one. Commodus would strip off the imperial purple, oil up, and step into the arena dressed in lion skins and golden armor, declaring himself a living god, Hercules reborn. He fought hundreds of matches, always rigged in his favor, against disabled opponents, animals with blunted claws, or terrified slaves handed wooden swords. And yet, he demanded applause as if he'd just conquered Gaul. But while Rome cringed through his public battles, the palace hosted games of a different kind. Commodus kept lovers of all genders, dressed them in gladiator outfits, and turned intimacy into a power play. These weren't private trysts or whispered affairs. They were performances deeply choreographed, sometimes costumed, always supervised by an inner circle of sycophants who dared not look too long nor look away. He had a particular fondness for role reversal, often casting himself as the victorious warrior and his partners, men and women alike, as the conquered. Some were dressed as vanquished barbarians, others as captured nobles. There were rules, props, scripts. He'd enter the room like a general returning from campaign, chest glistening, sandals thudding, his partner already kneeling, already in character. But unlike other emperors who buried their perversions in metaphor, Commodus seemed to understand exactly what he was doing. He wasn't hiding behind allegory, he was building a brand. He renamed the months of the Roman calendar after himself, renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, and made the Senate refer to him as the invincible gladiator. His ego wasn't bloated, it had metastasized. His harem included not just concubines and noblewomen, but gladiators, soldiers, and eunuchs dressed as Amazons. He surrounded himself with bodies sculpted, armored, choreographed not for affection, but for spectacle. Everything was a stage, and everyone was cast. He once ordered a banquet to be served by naked dancers painted gold, who acted out mythological battles, while guests were expected to eat in silence, watching the show unfold around them. For dessert, he delivered a monologue, shirtless, sword in hand, swearing to destroy Rome's enemies with the same fury he'd just shown in bed. The problem was, Rome's enemies weren't on the battlefield. They were in the Senate, in the streets, in the palace itself. And they were tired of clapping. Eventually, his paranoia grew unbearable. He executed senators for imagined insults, had nobles assassinated for failing to applaud loudly enough. The people feared him, the Senate loathed him, and the palace guards, his last line of protection, stopped pretending they liked the entertainment. In 192 CE, he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler. Not in battle, not in glory, but naked, wet, and utterly alone. Rome tried to erase him. His statues were torn down, his proclamations burned, his name struck from official records. But some stains don't wash out, and Commodus remains as a symbol not of madness, but of performance unchecked, of what happens when a ruler believes that every desire deserves a stage. And while the sands of the Colosseum settled far away in the hills of East Africa, a very different kind of king was rewriting the rules of power in even more chilling ways. Because King Mwanga II of Buganda didn't fight for attention. He demanded submission or death. King Mwanga II of Buganda. Some rulers seduce with charm, some tempt with gifts. King Mwanga II of Buganda, reigning from 1884 to 1897, did neither. His approach to intimacy and authority was brutally direct. You submitted to his will, or you didn't remain alive to refuse twice. He ascended the throne as a teenager, inheriting one of the most powerful kingdoms in East Africa, a land of complex court politics, deep spiritual traditions, and growing tension from the encroachment of European colonial powers. The young king was surrounded by advisors, chiefs, and foreign missionaries all vying for influence. But Mwanga wasn't interested in being molded into a modern monarch. He had no patience for moral lectures and no appetite for limits, especially when it came to the bodies of those around him. His court was filled with male pages, adolescent attendants drawn from noble families, trained in etiquette, service, and loyalty to the throne. In Buganda's tradition, they were meant to be close to the king, but under Mwanga, proximity came with dangerous strings. He expected personal service to extend far beyond pouring drinks or carrying messages. It became an unspoken and sometimes spoken demand that loyalty to the monarch be proven through intimate compliance. At first, the pressure was subtle. A page might be summoned late at night, asked to stay after the others were dismissed. Those who complied were rewarded with favor, gifts, or rapid promotion in the palace hierarchy. Those who hesitated were met with simmering resentment that could turn deadly without warning. Mwanga's desires weren't a secret in the palace, they were an open threat. This volatile dynamic exploded when Christian missionaries began gaining influence in Buganda. They brought not only new religion, but new rules that conflicted directly with the king's authority. Some of Mwanga's pages converted, adopting moral codes that condemned his demands outright. Refusal, once rare, became more common. And Mwanga, used to instant obedience, took it as a personal rebellion. The punishment was swift and brutal. Those who defied him were executed, sometimes privately, sometimes as public warnings. The most infamous of these killings occurred in 1886, when a group of young Christian converts, many of them palace pages, refused the king's advances and were sentenced to death. They were burned alive on the orders of a ruler who saw their resistance not just as personal insult, but as political mutiny. To Mwanga, these executions weren't about morality, they were about control. Every refusal was an erosion of his authority, a chipping away at the unquestioned dominance a king was supposed to enjoy. And Mwanga, already paranoid about colonial encroachment, believed that if he couldn't command loyalty in his own chambers, he couldn't command it anywhere. Yet his brutality didn't secure his throne. If anything, it weakened it. Chiefs turned against him, missionaries called for his removal, and British colonial forces saw in him a perfect excuse to interfere more directly in Buganda's affairs. He was deposed, reinstated, and deposed again. His reign, an unstable cycle of flight, return, and eventual exile. By the time he died in 1903, far from his kingdom, Mwanga was a figure both feared and pitied, remembered less as a ruler and more as a cautionary tale. He had inherited a throne but ruled it like a fortress of compulsion, mistaking fear for loyalty until neither remained. And as Buganda adjusted to life under colonial oversight, another emperor on the other side of the world was building his own court of carefully selected companions, not to threaten or punish them, but to marvel at their improbable skill. Because Emperor Guangxu of the Qing dynasty didn't rule through intimidation. He ruled through acrobatics. Emperor Guangxu of Qing China. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was a creaking ship caught in a storm, foreign powers carving it up from the outside, corrupt officials hollowing it out from the inside. And at the center of it all sat Emperor Guangxu, a man history remembers mostly for his political helplessness under the shadow of the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi. But behind the formal robes, the timid speeches, and the carefully staged audiences, Guangxu had a quieter, stranger indulgence, an imperial fascination with acrobatics. Not the kind you'd see at a public festival, tumblers in the street, fire breathers in the market. No. Guangxu's acrobatics happened in private, behind the high vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, where politics were suffocating and the emperor's personal amusements became the only thing he could actually control. He was never a powerful ruler in the traditional sense. Adopted into the role at the age of 4, Guangxu grew up in a palace where every decision from military strategy to what he ate for breakfast was filtered through Qi's authority. By the time he came of age, he had little experience in commanding others, and even less in resisting the will of those who commanded him. That didn't stop him from finding ways to carve out small spaces of autonomy, and one of those spaces was the inner court entertainment. His concubines were not chosen only for beauty or lineage. Many were selected for their ability to perform feats of balance, strength, and contortion that bordered on the surreal. They trained in secret halls, converted into practice rooms, floors padded, ceilings reinforced, servants sworn to silence. Some could balance on one foot atop a pole, spinning slowly while holding a porcelain vase on their heads. Others could form human towers 3 bodies high, every movement precise, every breath controlled. These weren't casual amusements. They were choreographed, rehearsed, and staged for Guangxu's personal viewing. The performances blurred the line between athleticism and theatre, between skill and seduction. It wasn't enough to simply tumble or leap. The routines were designed to draw out the suspense, to turn physical discipline into a kind of living sculpture that the emperor could admire from his cushioned seat. The costumes, too, were part of the spectacle. Silk robes cut to reveal the arc of a limb mid-spin. Embroidery designed to catch the candlelight when a performer arched backward. Anklets that chimed in time with their movements. Everything was engineered to keep the emperor's gaze fixed, to make him forget for a few minutes the political paralysis that defined his reign. Servants said that Guangxu rarely applauded during these performances. Instead, he watched with an intensity that made even seasoned entertainers nervous. He would ask about the techniques afterward, how the body could bend so far without breaking, how a performer could hold a pose without trembling. There was a strange, almost academic fascination in his questioning, as though he saw in these physical feats a reflection of the control and grace he himself could never master in court. But the sessions were more than just escape. In a palace where he was constantly undermined, these performances were one of the few places where Guangxu could dictate every detail, the lighting, the music, the sequence of acts. For once, he was the unchallenged authority. And for a man otherwise treated as a ceremonial ornament in his own empire, that mattered. The irony, of course, was that while Guangxu watched bodies bend and balance, his own political position was anything but steady. His ill-fated 100 Days Reform in 1898, a desperate attempt to modernize China, ended in humiliating failure when Cixi had him placed under virtual house arrest. From then until his death in 1908, his private entertainments became one of his last remaining freedoms. He never saw the dynasty collapse, but perhaps he sensed it coming. In the last months of his life, the performances reportedly became slower, quieter, less about dazzling skill, and more about the illusion of stillness, of holding a pose against the pull of gravity for as long as possible. And when Guangxu finally died, just a day before Cixi herself, the performers were dismissed, their routines forgotten. The inner court returned to silence. Yet far to the west, another ruler had mastered the art of movement in secrecy, not through acrobatics, but through hidden corridors and invisible doors that connected him to his lovers, like a spider in the center of a very private web. Because Philip IV of Spain didn't wait for the performance to come to him. He built passageways so he could appear in it at will. King Philip IV of Spain. In portraits, King Philip IV of Spain always looks like a man weighed down by the burdens of empire, solemn eyes, stiff posture, lips pressed into the kind of tight line that suggests long hours of contemplating the fate of nations. The reality? Much of that contemplation took place while deciding which of the hidden passageways in the royal palace he would use to visit a mistress without being seen. Philip ruled from 1621 to 1665, presiding over an empire so vast it was said the sun never set on it. But that empire was also in decline, bleeding gold from endless wars, crumbling under debt, and increasingly mocked by rival nations. For Philip, public life was a relentless parade of councils, treaties, and humiliating military reports. Private life, however, was a different story. A maze of velvet corridors, whispered rendezvous, and an architecture designed not for statecraft, but for stealth. The Royal Alcazar of Madrid Philip's palace was not just a fortress, it was a labyrinth. Beneath its formal chambers and ceremonial halls was a network of narrow hallways, concealed staircases, and false walls that allowed the king to move between rooms unseen. To outsiders, these were simply architectural curiosities left over from older renovations. To Philip, they were lifelines. They allowed him to vanish from a meeting and reappear in a private chamber where one of his mistresses would already be waiting. The system was efficient. Trusted servants operated as silent guides and lookouts, ensuring that the king's nocturnal journeys went unnoticed by the courtiers whose gossip could undo reputations. Lovers could be brought in or sent away without the scrutiny of the public eye. The hidden passages connected not just private apartments, but sometimes led straight into secluded rooms that Philip had furnished specifically for his personal escapades. Small, warm spaces filled with rugs, low couches, and carafes of wine. These weren't just affairs of the heart or even of simple lust. They were part of Philip's coping mechanism, a way to escape the suffocating reality of ruling an empire in decline. Every step through those hidden corridors was a step away from bad news, away from the politics he couldn't fix, and toward the fantasy that he still had absolute control over something. His lovers were many, but they were carefully placed. Most were drawn from noble families whose loyalty could be secured through royal favor. In some cases, these affairs were political tools. A whispered promise in the dark could ensure support in a vote. A quiet tryst could cement an alliance more effectively than a treaty. But in other cases, they were simply indulgences, moments Philip took for himself in a life where nearly every other moment was dictated by obligation. The king's use of the hidden passages was an open secret among his inner circle, though few dared to speak of it aloud. Foreign envoys hinted at his nightly disappearances in coded letters, and the court's playwrights, masters of sly insinuation, sometimes wove jokes about vanishing kings into their comedies. Philip ignored them. He was confident in the discretion of his servants and the loyalty of the women he chose. But no matter how carefully hidden, secrets have a way of seeping through the walls. Over time, whispers reached the streets of Madrid. Tales of the king's invisible footsteps circulated in taverns. It became something between a rumor and a legend, that at any moment King Philip could appear in your room as if conjured from the shadows. For a man who spent his public life rigidly bound by ceremony, the freedom of those clandestine movements must have been intoxicating. The hidden corridors were his escape hatches, not from danger, but from reality. And as Spain's military losses mounted and its treasury emptied, the king seemed to spend more time in those private routes than in the council chambers. When Philip died in 1665, the palace remained corridors intact, secrets sealed. Later monarchs used them for their own purposes, but the legend of Philip's shadow walking lingered. Because if the empire was collapsing in the light, at least in the dark, behind a hidden door, the king could still feel like a conqueror. And far across the Mediterranean, another ruler had abandoned the pretense of shadows altogether. His retreats weren't secret, and his appetites weren't disguised. On the island of Capri, Emperor Tiberius ruled in full view of his pleasures, because when you own the villa, the cliff, and the sea below, there's nowhere left to hide. Emperor Tiberius of Rome. If Augustus built the Roman Empire and Caligula nearly turned it into a circus, Emperor Tiberius was the one who decided he'd rather not deal with the city at all. By the last decade of his reign, he withdrew entirely from Rome and set up residence on the island of Capri, a cliff-bound fortress rising out of the Tyrrhenian Sea, where he could run the empire at a distance and indulge himself without interruption. Officially, his retreat was framed as a practical decision. Capri was secure, isolated, and beautiful. It was far from the scheming senators, far from the mobs of the Forum, and far from the constant political bickering of the capital. But in reality, it was something else. A carefully constructed stage for one of the most notorious private courts in imperial history. Tiberius had never been a man of warmth or charisma. Reserved, calculating, often cold, he had a knack for alienating those around him. Even as a general, he had inspired more obedience than love. But on Capri, with the weight of public appearances gone, he built a world entirely to his liking. And that world, as surviving accounts suggest, was one of control, indulgence, and a particular fixation on spectacle, the kind only an emperor could afford. His villas on the island, most famously Villa Jovis, weren't just luxury homes. They were compounds, sprawling complexes of terraces, private chambers, hidden stairways, and sea-facing balconies. Behind their high walls, Tiberius created a microcosm where the only laws were his whims. The courtyards were filled with attendants, entertainers, musicians, and a hand-picked retinue of companions, both male and female, chosen as much for their appearance and pliability as for any social rank. These companions weren't simply guests, they were part of a permanent, living tableau. They were trained, dressed, and staged to suit the emperor's tastes. Even the servants were selected for their looks and grace. The whole environment blurred the line between household and theatre. Tiberius was known for his discipline and governance, at least in the early years, but on Capri, he let go of restraint. Feasts were frequent and elaborate, and the entertainments after them often pushed the boundaries of what Roman decorum allowed. Some involved intricate performances set against the backdrop of the sea, with dancers and actors moving in synchrony along the terraces, mimicking scenes from myth or history. Others were more intimate and personal, designed for the emperor's eyes alone. The most infamous part of his Capri retreat was the training of his so-called minnows, a group of youths, both boys and girls, taught elaborate routines meant to delight the emperor in the villa's secluded pools. Ancient writers, especially Suetonius and Tacitus, relished in describing these scenes in lurid detail, though their accounts were undoubtedly coloured by politics and personal bias. Whether exaggerated or not, they cemented Tiberius's reputation as a ruler who traded the dignity of the purple for the indulgences of a private fantasy kingdom. Isolation only deepened his eccentricities. The longer he stayed away from Rome, the less he seemed to care about its opinion of him. Messages and decrees were still sent to the Senate, but they arrived with the detachment of a man who no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. His focus was on Capri, on maintaining his self-made paradise and ensuring that no news, no scandal, no war could disturb it. But power can't be contained on an island forever. Rumours leaked back to Rome, carried by disgruntled courtiers, dismissed servants, or simply those who couldn't resist telling the capital's gossip-hungry elite about the emperor's private life. By the time of his death in 37 CE, Tiberius had become, in the public imagination, less a statesman and more a decadent recluse, a man who abandoned the city that made him in favour of sunlit terraces and shadowed chambers. When word of his death reached Rome, there was little mourning. The Senate declared the new emperor with relief, as if a long fever had broken. But the villas of Capri remained, silent witnesses to a chapter of imperial history that was as much about the power to withdraw as it was about the power to rule. And centuries later, in a very different desert kingdom, another ruler would also be remembered for his appetites not hidden away in an island fortress, but paraded openly in the sheer number of wives and companions he kept. King Ibn Saud wasn't subtle. He was a monarch who measured status not in palaces or provinces, but in the size of his harem. King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. By the time King Abdulaziz ibn Saud unified the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into what would become Saudi Arabia in 1932, he had already secured a reputation as a man of immense presence, tall, broad-shouldered, a commanding figure who combined tribal authority with political cunning. He was a founder, a warrior, and a shrewd negotiator. But behind the epic story of battles and treaties was another kind of legend, one whispered in majlises, hinted at in diplomatic diaries, and half buried in family lore. The king's extraordinary appetite for women, and his highly specific preferences. Polygamy was not unusual in his cultural and religious context, but Ibn Saud took it to a scale that made even other monarchs raise an eyebrow. Over the course of his life, he married at least 20 women, some say many more, and fathered upwards of 40 sons, not counting his daughters, whose numbers were less often recorded, but almost certainly matched or exceeded that figure. Marriage, for Ibn Saud, was as much about consolidating alliances as it was about companionship. Each wife linked him to a tribe or a powerful family, cementing loyalty through blood ties. But alliances weren't the whole story. Within his vast household, the king was known for his personal preferences, and one of those was unconventional for his time and place. He was said to have a deep fascination with women of particularly large stature. While the prevailing beauty ideal in the region leaned toward the slender and delicately proportioned, Ibn Saud preferred the opposite. To him, size was not only attractive but symbolic, a sign of health, abundance, and, perhaps in his mind, royal stature. This preference wasn't a rumour confined to the palace walls. It filtered out through servants, visiting dignitaries, and even foreign journalists who met the king. One Western envoy, writing privately, described Ibn Saud's harem as an assemblage remarkable, not just for its number, but for the formidable presence of its ladies. These women, chosen for both their political significance and their physicality, became a quiet but defining element of the king's personal mythos. Inside the royal compounds, life for Ibn Saud's wives and concubines was opulent but heavily controlled. The women were attended by maids, given fine clothing and jewellery, and shielded from the public eye. They lived in separate quarters, luxurious, but enclosed where the routines of domesticity were punctuated by the king's visits. When the king entered, it was less like a husband returning home and more like a tribal leader conducting court. His presence filled the room, and his preferences were law. Despite his personal indulgences, Ibn Saud's charisma was such that even those aware of his private habits spoke of him with respect. He was physically imposing, known for his booming voice and sharp wit, able to switch from warm hospitality to fierce negotiation without missing a beat. In political terms, his marriages were masterstrokes. Each new union shored up his legitimacy and reduced the likelihood of tribal rebellion. But in personal terms, they painted a portrait of a man for whom desire and strategy were intertwined. The king's taste in women was only one facet of a personality that blended tradition with personal will. In the early years of Saudi Arabia, his authority was absolute, his word was law, his alliances unquestioned. But his domestic life reflected the same underlying philosophy as his politics: collect, consolidate, and keep close what you value. By the time of his death in 1953, Ibn Saud left behind not just a united kingdom, but a dynasty whose members today number in the thousands. His many children, particularly his sons, went on to rule the country in succession, each inheriting not only his throne, but his example of using personal life as an extension of political power. And while the Arabian Peninsula moved into the Oil Age, far to the north, another ruler, equally concerned with display but of a far stranger variety, was arranging his personal guard for an entirely different kind of spectacle. Emperor Paul I of Russia wasn't interested in harems. He preferred parades, especially when his soldiers weren't wearing much at all. Emperor Paul I of Russia. Emperor Paul I of Russia was a man out of step with his own empire and perhaps with reality itself. Ruling from 1796 to 1801, his reign was short, unpredictable, and filled with decisions that baffled his ministers and alienated nearly everyone who had to serve under him. Yet among the many eccentricities that defined Paul, one stood out in the whispered gossip of his court: his peculiar fondness for reviewing military drills, performed by female guards dressed in uniforms that were generously abbreviated. Paul's military obsessions were well known. From the moment he took the throne, he set about remaking the Russian army according to his own rigid, almost fetishistic vision of discipline. He scrapped much of Catherine the Great's more relaxed approach to military etiquette, replacing it with an exacting Prussian-style system. Soldiers were drilled to march with machine-like precision, uniforms had to meet impossible standards, and punishments for errors were severe. For Paul, military display wasn't just a matter of readiness, it was theatre. And that theatre occasionally took a more personal turn. He was particularly interested in the regiment of the Chevalier Guards, an elite cavalry unit that included women selected for ceremonial duties. Under Paul's direction, these women were sometimes outfitted in uniforms tailored less for battle readiness and more for aesthetic appeal: fitted jackets, high boots, and skirts cropped shorter than tradition dictated, allowing for greater freedom of movement, a phrase that seemed to apply as much to the emperor's viewing pleasure as to any practical military need. Drills became something between inspection and performance. Paul would watch intently from a reviewing platform or a palace balcony as the guards marched, pivoted, and rode in precise formations. He was known to comment not only on the sharpness of their movements, but on the way the uniforms fit, on how the fabric moved with the body. His praise often went to those who could combine military perfection with what he considered graceful bearing. The emperor's fascination didn't stop at public reviews. On certain occasions, he would order private drills on palace grounds, with only a select audience of courtiers and aides present. These smaller gatherings were conducted in a more relaxed atmosphere, with the guards sometimes wearing ceremonial dress that was lighter, brighter, and more revealing than the standard issue. Paul justified this as experimenting with uniform design, but those in attendance could see where his true interest lay. Yet to frame Paul solely as a man indulging a uniformed fantasy would miss the deeper strangeness of his reign. His fixations, whether on military attire, parade drills, or rigid etiquette, were symptoms of a broader, consuming need for control. Paul had lived most of his life in the shadow of his formidable mother, Catherine the Great, who had kept him from real power and allegedly even considered bypassing him in the line of succession. When he finally became emperor, he governed like a man determined to impose his will on every inch of the empire, from the parade ground to the palace bedroom. This overreach bred resentment. His constant micromanaging, erratic orders, and unpredictable tempers alienated the nobility, the army, and even his own family. The military, the institution he prized most, grew weary of his constant interference. The female guards may have endured his inspections in silence, but elsewhere in the ranks, discontent brewed. It came to a head in 1801, when a conspiracy of senior officers and nobles stormed his chambers in the Mikhailovsky castle. Accounts of his death vary. Some say he was strangled, others that he was beaten, but all agree it was swift, and that his son Alexander was quickly proclaimed the new emperor. Paul's fascination with female guards and their tailored uniforms faded into palace gossip, overshadowed by the chaos of his rule and the manner of his death. Still, the image lingered in the minds of those who served him. The emperor standing stiff-backed on a reviewing stand, eyes fixed on his marching soldiers, applauding precision with the same fervor others reserved for beauty, or perhaps the other way around. And across the Adriatic, another king would cultivate his own unusual personal tastes, not in the parade ground, but in his private rooms, where the scent of perfume was as much a part of the ritual as the act itself. King Zog I of Albania wasn't interested in military drills. He was interested in the exact fragrance of the women he invited into his life. King Zog I of Albania. If most monarchs of the early 20th century were trying to project the image of modern, forward-thinking leadership, King Zog I of Albania seemed determined to build his own legend out of quirks. He ruled a small and politically volatile kingdom wedged between great powers, and he did it with an almost theatrical blend of personal vanity, strict etiquette, and eccentric personal habits. Among those habits, one stood out in the whispered recollections of palace staff and the curious notes of foreign envoys. Zog's fascination with collecting explicit postcards and his insistence that lovers wear specific perfumes during their encounters with him. Born Ahmet Muhtar Zagoli in 1895, Zog rose from a tribal chieftain to the throne through a combination of political maneuvering, family alliances, and sheer opportunism. When he declared himself king in 1928, he inherited a country still balancing old Ottoman traditions with Western influences. The capital, Tirana, was growing into a modern city, but Zog's court remained a place where personal indulgence could slip easily into royal policy. Perfume was not simply a luxury item for Zog, it was an obsession. He had an almost archivist's approach to scent. His private chambers contained shelves of imported fragrances from Paris, Milan, and Istanbul, each stored in ornate glass bottles. For Zog, a perfume wasn't just a smell, it was an identity, a marker of a specific memory or mood. He reportedly assigned certain perfumes to certain women, sometimes insisting they wear only that scent whenever they saw him. The result was that a fragrance became inextricably linked to its wearer in the king's mind. This wasn't just a romantic quirk, it was a form of cataloguing. Zog kept a mental and possibly literal record of scents, associating each with the political or personal role that woman played in his life. The queen of the moment might wear something floral and dignified. A discreet lover from a politically sensitive family might wear a rarer, spicier blend that lingered in a room long after she had left. Then there were the postcards. While traveling abroad or receiving gifts from European diplomats, Zog amassed a private collection of risque postcards, photographs, and illustrations that were decidedly not intended for public display in the conservative climate of Albania at the time. Some were artistic nudes in the style of Parisian photography studios. Others were more playful, even comedic. He stored them in lacquered boxes, kept under lock and key, occasionally leafing through them like a connoisseur examining a prized library. Palace insiders hinted that these two obsessions scent and image sometimes overlapped. A postcard might remind Zog of a certain woman's perfume, and that fragrance could suddenly be reinstated in his private circles, like an old song reintroduced into the royal playlist. There was a method to his indulgence, even if it appeared whimsical to outsiders. Of course, these private habits existed alongside a reign filled with intrigue, assassination attempts, and the looming threat of foreign invasion. Zog survived multiple attempts on his life, one famously in 1931, when he reportedly returned fire at would-be assassins outside the Vienna Opera House. This combination of personal danger and personal indulgence made him an object of fascination in the European press. The king, who carried a pistol in public, collected perfume like a sommelier collects vintages, and kept a locked archive of images that no one dared publicly acknowledge. But the real world eventually caught up with him. In 1939, Mussolini's Italy invaded Albania, forcing Zog into exile. He left the country with his family, his gold reserves, and, according to persistent rumor, some of his perfume bottles and postcard collection, though whether that was practical sentimentality or just habit is anyone's guess. He never regained his throne, spending the rest of his life wandering Europe and the Middle East, a king without a kingdom, but never without a scent trailing behind him. Zog's fascination with the sensory, the way smell and image could fix a moment in amber, was his quiet rebellion against the instability of his reign. In perfume and postcards, he could control memory. In politics, he could not. And long before Zog was born, in the heart of Mughal India, another emperor had also mastered the art of making memory a spectacle, not through scent or photographs, but through the sight of water, steam, and bodies moving in choreographed unison. Emperor Akbar the Great didn't collect perfume. He collected the vision of his concubines bathing together. Emperor Akbar, the Great of Mughal India. Akbar the Great is remembered in history books as one of the most remarkable rulers of the Mughal Empire, a conqueror, a reformer, and a statesman whose policies of religious tolerance and administrative skill allowed his realm to flourish. But outside the official chronicles, there's another side to Akbar's court, one less concerned with diplomacy and more concerned with a very specific kind of spectacle: the carefully orchestrated, almost ritualized sight of his concubines bathing together. Akbar ruled from 1556 to 1605, transforming a fragmented territory into a vast, centralized empire that stretched across much of the Indian subcontinent. His reign is rightly celebrated for its military victories and progressive reforms, but the Mughal court was also a place of immense luxury, and like all great courts, it reflected the personal tastes of the man at its head. The imperial harem was not a casual arrangement. It was an elaborate institution housing hundreds of women, wives, concubines, attendants, and entertainers, each with a designated role. The harem was both a domestic space and a political tool, binding noble families to the emperor through marriage alliances and offering a stage for diplomacy conducted behind screens and silks. Within this world, Akbar's preferences could become law. One of those preferences, according to persistent accounts, was the spectacle of collective bathing. In specially constructed marble baths within the palace, often fed by fountains and perfumed with rosewater, Akbar would have groups of concubines gather for bathing sessions that were as choreographed as any court performance. These were not crude displays but highly stylized rituals, where movement, music, and the play of light on water turned the moment into a kind of living artwork. The baths themselves were architectural marvels. Mughal engineers designed them with skylights that allowed sunlight to filter in at precise angles, catching the steam and creating an almost ethereal haze. Pools were often tiled in intricate geometric patterns, their colors intensified by the rippling water. The concubines' garments, when worn at all in the water, were made from fine muslin so light it clung and flowed, moving like liquid around the body. Attendants and musicians added to the atmosphere. Flutes, soft percussion, and the faint chime of ankle bells accompanied the sound of water splashing. The women moved in deliberate sequences, entering, rinsing, combing hair, applying scented oils, all under the emperor's watchful eye. To Akbar, it wasn't just an indulgence, it was theatre. Like many aspects of his court, the bathing rituals served a political function as well. They reinforced hierarchy, the favoured concubines placed closest to the emperor's vantage point, others further away, and they displayed Akbar's wealth and control over every element of palace life. In a way, they mirrored his governance, orderly, hierarchical, and deeply aware of presentation. Some chroniclers hinted that Akbar used these occasions not just for pleasure, but for decision-making. A concubine's grace in movement, her poise, her attentiveness to ritual, all could influence her standing in the emperor's favour. A misplaced gesture, a failure to follow the sequence precisely, could relegate a woman to the edges of palace life. Of course, such practices also fed into the Mughal Empire's image abroad. Traders, envoys, and travellers often returned home with exaggerated tales of the emperor's harem, describing scenes that blurred fact and fantasy. For many, Akbar's baths became a symbol of the empire's exotic splendor, a vision of power expressed not through gold or armies, but through controlled beauty. By the time of his death in 1605, Akbar had reshaped India politically and culturally, but the private rituals of his harem remained locked behind the palace walls, passed down only in rumour and guarded memoirs. The baths themselves, however, survived architectural remnants of a time when water, marble, and carefully staged intimacy were tools of imperial authority. And far away in England, another monarch would also shape his identity through ritualized presentation, not in marble baths, but in elaborate costumes and elaborate role play that followed him from court to court. Henry VIII didn't gather concubines in pools. He preferred to disguise himself entirely before making his entrance. King Henry VIII of England. When most people think of Henry VIII, they think of the 6 wives, the break from the Catholic Church, and the endless portraits of a broad-shouldered man staring out with the confidence of someone who could order your execution before breakfast. But beyond the political maneuvering and marital drama, Henry had another side, one that saw kingship not just as rulership, but as performance. And his favourite form of performance involved elaborate costumes, disguises, and theatrical entrances that blurred the line between courtly ceremony and private amusement. Henry ruled from 1509 to 1547, a period of enormous change in England. His court was a glittering centre of Renaissance culture, overflowing with music, poetry, and pageantry. The king himself was a skilled athlete, musician, and dancer in his youth, and he saw no reason why politics and pleasure couldn't share the same stage. This philosophy extended into his personal life, where he developed a fascination for costumed roleplay, not the simple masquerades of the nobility, but productions so elaborate that they required their own budgets, rehearsals, and wardrobes. One of Henry's favourite pastimes was the court masque, a kind of theatrical entertainment involving music, dance, and poetry, with the performers dressed in fantastical costumes. But Henry didn't just watch masks, he starred in them. And he rarely appeared as the king in these settings. Instead, he would disguise himself as a knight-errant, a wandering merchant, or a mysterious foreign prince, concealing his identity until the grand moment when the mask came off and the crowd realized they had been speaking to the sovereign himself. These moments were carefully orchestrated. Henry enjoyed the element of surprise the way courtiers and ladies-in-waiting would gasp, bow, or curtsy once they realized the stranger in front of them was the ruler of England. For him, it wasn't only about amusement, it was a test of courtly wit, loyalty, and perhaps susceptibility to flattery. Those who had spoken to him frankly, thinking him an unknown guest, were sometimes rewarded. Those who had gossiped or overstepped were reminded, gently or not, of the dangers of speaking too freely. But the king's costuming wasn't confined to public entertainment. In more private settings, Henry was known to don elaborate outfits for the sake of personal encounters. These weren't hastily assembled disguises, they were full regalia, often modelled after historical or mythical figures. He might arrive dressed as a crusader, in armour polished to a mirror sheen, or as a huntsman, complete with embroidered jerkin and feathered cap. There were stories of him arriving at a lady's chambers in disguise, pretending to be a messenger or a servant before dramatically revealing his true identity. The clothes themselves were a testament to his wealth and taste. Velvet, silk, cloth of gold, all trimmed with jewels, fur, or intricate embroidery. His tailors worked constantly, producing garments that were as much a display of craftsmanship as they were an indulgence in fantasy, and Henry had the presence to pull them off. Even as his body grew heavier in later years, he remained acutely aware of the effect that visual spectacle could have, both in winning hearts and in asserting dominance. For Henry, these disguises and role-plays were more than just games. They were part of a larger strategy of kingship, a way of controlling the narrative about who he was. A king could be terrifying, but he could also be charming, mysterious, and unpredictable. By blending theatre with politics, Henry kept his court on its toes, never entirely certain of what role he might play next. Of course, the later years of his reign saw less dancing and more grim statecraft. His injuries, illnesses, and political troubles made elaborate disguises rarer, but the reputation lingered. Even after his death, stories of the king's masquerades circulated in England, painting him as a man who could be both the most dangerous figure in the realm and its most flamboyant entertainer.